They built Sobibor so that no one would leave alive. Yet one day, prisoners turned the camp of death into a battlefield of defiance. Sobibor was not a camp of survival. It was a factory of death, designed for one purpose alone: extermination. And yet, in this place where hope was meant to be extinguished, one of the most daring acts of resistance in all of World War II unfolded. From the spring of 1942, wave after wave of transports arrived, carrying thousands of men, women, and children. For most, the journey ended within hours. They never even knew the name of the place that became their grave. But among those condemned, there were some who chose defiance over despair. They plotted in whispers, risking discovery with every glance, and on one October afternoon in 1943, they struck back against their captors. In a coordinated revolt, armed with stolen weapons, axes, and sheer determination, prisoners rose up, killing guards and breaking through the barbed wire. It was an escape born not of desperation alone, but of the will to prove that even here, where death ruled absolutely, human spirit could still resist. Sobibor was both tragedy and triumph. Tragedy, because nearly 250,000 lives were extinguished within its walls. Triumph, because hundreds defied the odds and ran for freedom, even though many would not live to tell their stories. Their uprising was a message to the world that silence would not be absolute, and even in the heart of darkness, resistance was possible. Tonight we journey into the forgotten history of Sobibor, its creation, its role in Operation Reinhard, the unimaginable suffering endured, and the astonishing revolt that shook the Nazi regime. This is not only the story of a death camp, but of courage, sacrifice, and the power of memory. So settle in, wherever you may be watching from, whether it's late at night in your bedroom, early morning on the other side of the world, or somewhere in between. For the next 4 hours, let the calm narration guide you through one of the most haunting and inspiring chapters of World War II. And before we begin, drop a comment below letting us know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. We love seeing this history connect people across the globe. This is the entire history of Sobibor, escape and tragedy. The story of Sobibor begins not in the forests of eastern Poland, but in the poisonous roots of Nazi racial ideology. At the heart of Hitler's worldview was the belief in a racial hierarchy, with so-called Aryans at the top, and Jews cast as subhuman. This obsession with purity was not an abstract theory, but a driving force behind every political and military decision. From the earliest days of the Nazi movement, anti-Semitism was presented as both a cultural and biological struggle. Jews were portrayed as enemies not only of Germany but of civilization itself, a threat that had to be eliminated. The Nazis wove pseudoscience into their propaganda, using distorted biology to justify persecution. Hitler's Jewish question was never a question of coexistence, but of eradication. By the outbreak of World War II, the path from prejudice to extermination was already being paved. The promise of empire, conquest, and domination was tied inseparably to the destruction of European Jewry. Sobibor would emerge as one of the dark instruments forged to realize this vision. The road to Sobibor was part of a broader plan known as the Final Solution. This policy, formulated in stages and solidified by 1941, aimed at the systematic extermination of Europe's Jews. The machinery of death was not created overnight. It evolved from ghettos, starvation, and mass shootings. By 1942, these methods were deemed too slow, too public, and too inefficient for the scale of genocide envisioned. The Nazi leadership sought a solution that combined secrecy, speed, and industrial efficiency. Out of this need came Operation Reinhard, the code name for the extermination of Polish Jewry in the general government. Its purpose was chillingly clear: to murder nearly 2 million Jews in specially constructed death camps. 3 sites were chosen: Belzec, Treblinka and Sobibor, each designed exclusively for mass killing. Sobibor, like its counterparts, would not be a labor camp but a killing factory. Its entire existence revolved around turning human beings into ash and memory. Operation Reinhard was the most lethal phase of the Holocaust, claiming more lives in less time than any other single operation of genocide. Named after Reinhard Heydrich, one of the chief architects of the final solution, it was both a tribute and a continuation of his murderous vision after his assassination in 1942. Belzec opened first, followed by Sobibor and Treblinka, together forming a triangle of death in occupied Poland. These camps were chosen for their isolation, their proximity to rail lines, and their ability to conceal mass murder from the eyes of the world. Each was staffed by SS officers and Ukrainian guards trained at the Trawnicki camp, ensuring loyalty and efficiency. Unlike Auschwitz, which functioned as both a concentration and extermination camp, the Reinhard camps existed solely to kill. Prisoners were rarely registered, for their lives ended almost immediately upon arrival. In their design lay the cold precision of bureaucratic murder. Sobibor was built to be a place where life ended within hours of arrival. The choice of Sobibor as one of these sites was no accident. It was located in the Lublin district of eastern Poland, a region dense with Jewish communities and strategically suited for deportations. The village of Sobibor was remote, surrounded by forests and marshes, offering both concealment and natural barriers against escape. A railway line connected it directly to major cities like Lublin, Warsaw, and beyond, enabling efficient transport of victims. The land was sparsely populated, making secrecy easier to maintain. Local Polish villagers, though aware of unusual activity, had limited access to the camp's inner workings. For the Nazis, the location combined practical logistics with deadly efficiency. It was far enough from the outside world to hide the truth, yet close enough to rail lines to process transports rapidly. Sobibor's very geography made it the perfect setting for a killing machine disguised as a camp. Geography became complicity in genocide. The Nazis designed Sobibor not as a place of imprisonment, but as a place of annihilation. Its construction began in early 1942, overseen by SS officers experienced in earlier killing operations. Lessons learned from mobile killing squads and the euthanasia program known as a Kachin T4 were applied to Sobibor's design. The camp was divided into zones, one for administration and guards, one for prisoners forced into labor, and one for extermination. The most secret zone contained the gas chambers, hidden at the far end of a path cynically referred to as the road to heaven. Every detail served a purpose, from the arrival ramp to the barbed wire fences camouflaged with branches. Sobibor was a place where deception was as vital as brutality. Victims were told they were being resettled, encouraged to undress for showers, and then led unknowingly to their deaths. The architecture itself was a weapon of murder. In Sobibor's design, illusion and death walked hand in hand. The decision to expand the killing network with Sobibor stemmed from the Nazis' growing urgency to complete the final solution. By 1942, Hitler demanded acceleration, and Himmler promised results. Belzec had already proven the model workable, but its capacity was limited. Treblinka was under construction, yet another site was required to meet the genocidal quota. Sobibor would serve this purpose, supplementing the machinery of death. It was calculated that Sobibor could kill hundreds of thousands within months, meeting targets dictated from Berlin. This industrial vision of genocide revealed the cold pragmatism of the Nazi state. Murder was not spontaneous or chaotic. It was scheduled, quantified, and executed like an administrative task. Sobibor became a cog in this machine, designed not to fail but to fulfill quotas. Its existence was evidence that extermination was not incidental to Nazi war aims. It was central to them. Sobibor was built because killing was policy, not consequence. At the heart of Sobibor's story is the fact that it was deliberately erased from the landscape of memory. From the beginning, it was built to be hidden, its very purpose cloaked in secrecy. Unlike concentration camps, which allowed the world to see prisoners behind fences, extermination camps left little trace of their victims. Sobibor was designed so that almost no one would survive to tell its story. Deportees were killed within hours, their possessions stolen, their bodies burned in open pits. The Nazis intended for Sobibor to be both efficient in death and invisible in history. Even its construction used deception, with locals told little and workers sworn to silence. The camp existed on the margins of maps, concealed behind forest and fear. The decision to build Sobibor reflected not only the intent to kill, but the intent to erase. It was a camp designed to murder memory itself. Thus, the road to Sobibor was paved with ideology, bureaucracy, and cold calculation. It was not a sudden improvisation, but the logical extension of Nazi racial doctrine and genocidal ambition. From Hitler's rhetoric to Himmler's orders, from Heydrich's blueprints to the spades of laborers in Poland, every step brought Sobibor into being. It was one of the darkest creations of a regime that thrived on secrecy and cruelty. Sobibor's significance lies not only in the lives it consumed, but in what it represented: the total surrender of humanity to ideology. A quiet village became a stage for mechanized murder. A forest became the veil for unspeakable crimes, and a railway line became the artery through which victims were fed into oblivion. The camp's birth was the convergence of hatred, efficiency, and geography. The story of Sobibor begins here, with the decision to build death into the very landscape of Poland. In the early months of 1942, as snow melted across eastern Poland, a secret project began deep within the forests near the small village of Sobibor. German engineers and SS planners had already scouted the location, identifying its isolation as ideal for their purpose. The site was remote, surrounded by thick woodlands and marshy ground that muffled sound and discouraged escape. Few villagers ventured near, and those who did were often warned off or intimidated into silence. Construction crews, including forced laborers and civilian contractors, were brought in under strict supervision. They were told little, often misled about the camp's true function, believing it to be a military installation or transit point. Guard towers were erected before buildings, establishing surveillance over workers and concealing the larger purpose of the project. German officers inspected progress regularly, pushing for speed and efficiency. By spring, the outline of Sobibor had already begun to emerge in the forest clearing. A place of death was being raised under a cloak of secrecy. From the outset, the camp was designed with precision, each section serving a distinct role in the process of extermination. The entrance area, known as the reception zone, was the first stage where trains carrying human cargo would arrive. A small siding was constructed off the main rail line to allow deportation trains to roll directly into the camp. An unloading platform was built to resemble a modest railway station, complete with signs, flower pots, and false schedules to maintain the illusion of normalcy. Here victims would step from cattle cars dazed and desperate, unaware that their lives were measured in hours. Beyond this lay the living area where SS officers and Ukrainian guards resided in comfortable barracks. Adjacent to them were the prisoner barracks, wooden huts where forced laborers were housed in squalid, overcrowded conditions. Beyond these, the camp narrowed into a hidden section, the extermination zone. This deliberate arrangement allowed deception to blend seamlessly with destruction. Sobibor's layout was not accidental. It was a calculated architecture of murder. At the center of the camp's operation was the path known grimly as the Himmelfahrtstrasse, or Road to Heaven. This was a fenced, camouflaged corridor that led directly from the undressing barracks to the gas chambers. Prisoners, stripped of their belongings and dignity, were forced to walk this narrow path under guard. On either side, the fences were intertwined with branches and brush, blocking any view of what lay ahead. From the outside, it resembled a simple walkway, but for those inside it was the final march of life. The corridor funneled thousands toward their deaths in silence, its deceptive calm masking its lethal destination. The road to heaven was designed not to frighten, but to pacify, to make victims compliant until the last moment. Its very simplicity was its genius. There was no chance for hesitation or realization. In Sobibor, geography was transformed into weaponry. Every path, fence, and building was part of a murderous choreography. The gas chambers themselves were the true heart of Sobibor, though they were hidden from sight and shrouded in secrecy. Initially they were small wooden structures, fitted with exhaust engines, crude but lethal. Victims were crammed inside airtight rooms, and exhaust fumes pumped in, killing within minutes. Later, as deportations increased, these chambers were replaced by larger brick buildings capable of murdering hundreds at once. The exterior was plain, resembling bathhouses to maintain the deception. Chimneys vented smoke, and nearby pits served as burial sites for the bodies. SS officers monitored the process with cold detachment, timing each gassing like an industrial task. Ukrainian guards kept order outside, ensuring that no panic disrupted the operation. The gas chambers were the culmination of Sobibor's purpose, efficient, hidden, and merciless. In these rooms, human lives were extinguished with the turn of an engine. Surrounding the camp was a network of defenses that made escape nearly impossible. High barbed wire fences encircled Sobibor, interwoven with branches to obscure the view inside. Guard towers stood at each corner, manned constantly with rifles and machine guns. Beyond the immediate perimeter lay minefields, buried deliberately to kill any who attempted flight. The natural marshes and forests added another layer of deterrence, swallowing footsteps and offering little refuge. German shepherd dogs patrolled alongside Ukrainian guards, their presence a constant reminder of death waiting at the edge. The camp was thus sealed not only by physical barriers but by psychological ones, instilling terror in all who entered. For prisoners forced to labor within its walls, the fences became symbols of hopelessness. The very landscape was weaponized, trapping life within and keeping questions without. Sobibor's isolation was its deadliest defense. The SS living quarters, in sharp contrast, reflected the privilege of the perpetrators. Officers enjoyed well-built barracks, with heating, food, and even recreational areas. They lived comfortably just meters from mass murder, separated from atrocity by little more than fences and willful denial. Ukrainian guards, though lower in status, also lived better than the prisoners they tormented. Their barracks were modest but functional, positioned strategically to monitor camp operations. Daily life for the perpetrators included meals, rest, and even moments of leisure, as though Sobibor were an ordinary posting. Yet these comforts coexisted with their roles in killing, normalizing atrocity as routine duty. The contrast between luxury and horror was part of the camp's reality. For every officer sipping coffee, thousands perished unseen behind the fences. Sobibor's structure embodied the split between killers and victims, a chilling reflection of Nazi ideology made physical. The prisoner barracks, in comparison, were overcrowded wooden huts designed to break both body and spirit. These buildings housed the small number of Jews selected for forced labor, men and women tasked with sorting belongings, maintaining the camp, or assisting in concealment. Conditions were appalling: no sanitation, little warmth, and constant hunger. Prisoners were packed into bunks, disease spread quickly, and beatings were routine. Their proximity to death was inescapable, for they lived in the shadow of the gas chambers. They were forced to witness arrivals, hear screams, and handle the possessions of the murdered. Survival was not intended, only temporary usefulness. For many, life in the barracks was a slow death by starvation, exhaustion, or despair. Sobibor's prisoner housing was not for living, it was for delaying death until labor was no longer needed. By mid-1942, Sobibor was fully operational, its construction complete and its machinery of death in motion. What had begun as a clearing in the forest had become a factory of annihilation. Every section of the camp, from the railway platform to the gas chambers, was part of a seamless system of deception and destruction. The secrecy of its location ensured that the outside world remained largely unaware. To locals, the smoke and stench were unmistakable, but details remained hidden behind fear and silence. For the SS, Sobibor was a model of efficiency, capable of killing thousands a day with minimal manpower. Its design reflected both the lessons of previous killing centers and the cold ingenuity of Nazi planners. The camp stood as a monument to cruelty disguised as order. By the time its construction was complete, Sobibor was no longer just a camp. It was a machine built for genocide, and it would soon claim its place in the darkest chapter of human history. Operation Reinhard was the code name for the deadliest phase of the Holocaust, a campaign launched in 1942 with one single purpose: the annihilation of the Jews of occupied Poland. It was named after Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the final solution, who was assassinated in Prague in June of that year. The program was conceived as the systematic extermination of Jews in the general government, the central region of Poland under Nazi occupation. Unlike earlier campaigns of ghettoization and starvation, Operation Reinhard was defined by speed, secrecy, and industrial efficiency. It aimed not at repression, but at complete eradication. The program was coordinated directly from Berlin under Heinrich Himmler and carried out locally by Odilo Globoknik, SS and police leader in Lublin. Globoknik oversaw the construction and operation of 3 killing centers: Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Together, these camps formed the beating heart of Reinhard's machinery of death. By the time the operation ended in late 1943, nearly 2 million Jews had been murdered. Sobibor stood at the center of this plan, one node in a web of coordinated extermination. The coordination of these camps was not haphazard, but meticulously planned to create a system that operated like an assembly line of death. Belzec was the first to begin operations, serving as a grim prototype for the model that would be replicated at Sobibor and Treblinka. Lessons learned in Belzec about transport logistics, gassing efficiency, and concealment were quickly applied to Sobibor's design. When Treblinka opened shortly afterward, the 3 camps were synchronized to handle the massive influx of deportations ordered by Berlin. Rail lines were redirected, timetables drawn up, and trains dispatched with chilling regularity. Deportations from ghettos were scheduled in waves, ensuring each camp operated at near full capacity without overwhelming local resources. Communication flowed constantly between commanders, creating a seamless coordination of killing. The bureaucrats in Berlin monitored figures and reports, reducing human lives to statistics in ledgers. Sobibor was not a lone outpost, but part of a nationwide network. The killings were planned, scheduled, and recorded as if they were shipments of goods rather than people. Within this system, each camp had a specific role and character, though all shared the same purpose of extermination. Belzec was the experimental ground, the first to test large-scale gassing operations and refine methods of corpse disposal. Treblinka, once operational, became the largest of the three, responsible for the deaths of more than 800,000 Jews, primarily from Warsaw and surrounding regions. Sobibor occupied a unique place within this triangle of death. While smaller in overall numbers compared to Treblinka, Sobibor became the destination for Jews deported from across Europe, including the Netherlands, France, and Slovakia. It served as both a killing ground and, briefly, a site of forced labor that processed the belongings of the dead. Its relative size did not diminish its impact, for Sobibor was as relentless in purpose as its counterparts. Each train arrival meant hundreds or thousands of lives ended within hours. Together, these camps formed a chain that stretched across occupied Poland, each complementing the others. Sobibor's role was integral, completing the machinery of Reinhard's extermination. The bureaucratic efficiency of Operation Reinhard was perhaps its most chilling feature. Every stage of the process, from the seizure of Jews in ghettos to their arrival at the camps, was planned with administrative precision. German officials in cities and towns organized deportation lists, scheduling trains that would carry victims directly to death. Railway companies issued invoices for the transport of Jews, charging per person per kilometer, treating genocide as ordinary business. The SS coordinated timetables with railway bureaus to maximize the flow of victims while minimizing delays. At the camps themselves, arrival, selection, killing, and disposal followed a brutal rhythm, repeated daily. Reports were filed meticulously, numbers tallied, and efficiency evaluated. Bureaucracy turned mass murder into paperwork, and paperwork into progress reports. The extermination of entire communities was reduced to lines on charts. In Sobibor, as in Belzec and Treblinka, the genocide was not chaotic, it was ordered, scheduled, and systematized. Death became a routine, managed by clerks and officers alike. Sobibor's connection to Belzec and Treblinka was reinforced by shared personnel. Many of the SS officers and Ukrainian guards rotated between the camps, carrying with them methods, practices, and a culture of cruelty. Franz Stangl, who later commanded Treblinka, had first overseen Sobibor, shaping its early routines. Gustav Wagner, one of Sobibor's most feared SS men, had been trained in the Action T4 euthanasia program before arriving to refine his brutality in Sobibor. The Trauniki Guards, recruited from Soviet POW camps, were trained en masse and deployed across all Reinhard camps. This circulation of staff ensured a deadly consistency. Techniques perfected in one camp were swiftly implemented in another. Sobibor did not operate in isolation, but as part of a shared professional culture of genocide. Killing became not only a policy, but an expertise passed from one site to the next. The personnel themselves were the lifeblood of the Reinhard network, linking the camps in methods and mentality. Through them, the machinery of death functioned with chilling uniformity. The statistics of Operation Reinhard reveal the staggering scale of its efficiency. In just over a year and a half, Nearly 2 million Jews were exterminated across Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Belzec alone claimed approximately 430,000 lives, while Treblinka consumed more than 800,000. Sobibor's toll, estimated between 170,000 and 250,000, may seem smaller in comparison, but remains almost incomprehensible in human terms. Entire communities were erased in days. Villages, towns, and even cities were emptied of Jewish life. The figures were not accidental, but the result of a deliberate timetable of destruction. Berlin demanded quotas, and the camps delivered them with brutal efficiency. Each site contributed its share, together accomplishing a genocide on a scale unseen in human history. Sobibor's numbers represented not statistics but shattered families, broken cultures, and extinguished futures. Operation Reinhard was not an experiment. It was industrialized murder perfected, and Sobibor was one of its essential engines. For the victims, the coordination of Reinhard camps meant that there was no escape from the machinery of death. From Warsaw to Lublin, from Amsterdam to Paris, trains followed predictable routes to predictable ends. Communities believed deportation meant resettlement, unaware that the trains led only to death. In some cases, rumors filtered back of gas chambers and mass graves, but disbelief often prevailed. The Nazi deception campaign was comprehensive, designed to conceal truth until the final moment. Victims stepping from cattle cars at Sobibor saw flowers, signs, and SS officers posing as courteous officials. They were told they were being taken to showers or work assignments. In reality, every part of the arrival process was synchronized to lead them to the gas chambers. Their fate was not determined by chance, but by the machinery of Reinhard's coordination. Sobibor was not an exception but a cog in a vast extermination system. For those who entered, there was almost no path out. The operation of Sobibor within Reinhard reveals the dark genius of Nazi organization: murder disguised as order, atrocity presented as efficiency. It was part of a network that drew strength from coordination, each camp reinforcing the other in purpose and practice. Belzec pioneered, Treblinka expanded, and Sobibor perfected the method of systematic annihilation. Together they embodied the Nazi ambition to erase entire populations swiftly and silently. The bureaucratic machine ensured that genocide was not the act of individuals alone, but the policy of a state, managed by clerks, executed by guards, and overseen by officers. In this system, Sobibor was both unique and interchangeable, a distinct site of horror, yet one of several operating in deadly harmony. The story of Sobibor cannot be told without its context in Operation Reinhard, for it was part of a larger storm that swept across occupied Poland. It was built to kill, coordinated to kill, and remembered today as one piece of a monstrous whole. In Sobibor, as in Reinhard itself, bureaucracy became the mask of murder. In April 1942, the quiet forests near Sobibor, stirred with the sound of iron wheels clattering over rails, carrying the first transports of Jewish men, women, and children into the newly constructed camp. The deportees came from the Lublin district, where entire communities had already been uprooted by ghetto liquidations. Families were herded into cattle cars, told they were being resettled for labor in the East. The reality of the journey was brutal. Packed shoulder to shoulder, deprived of food, air, and water, many collapsed before reaching their destination. The smell of sweat, fear, and death filled the wagons, while guards shouted and struck anyone who faltered. For many, the journey itself was a torment that blurred into nightmare. Yet still, some clung to the hope that resettlement meant survival, that work camps awaited them at the end. That hope would vanish the moment the train slowed near Sobibor. The gates of the camp marked not a new beginning, but the end of life, and with each transport, The machinery of annihilation roared to life. When the first train arrived, the camp guards swung into action with chilling precision. The siding track built specifically for Sobibor allowed the train to pull directly inside, sealing the deportees' fate the moment the doors slid open. SS officers and Ukrainian auxiliaries stood ready with rifles and dogs, barking orders in German and Ukrainian. Prisoners were ordered to leave their belongings behind, told they would be returned later, reinforcing the illusion of resettlement. The deception was deliberate: calm the victims, prevent panic, and maintain order until the last possible moment. Meanwhile, the confiscated luggage was swiftly sorted by labor prisoners, stripped of anything valuable. Jewelry, clothing, and personal documents were separated into piles, transforming possessions into plunder. To the arrivals, the process seemed orderly, even routine, but behind the facades of signs and flowers on the platform lay only death. The camp was a stage set, and every guard an actor in the theater of deception. The victims were divided into groups almost immediately. Men were separated from women and children, the division carried out under the pretense of efficiency. They were told they would be showered and disinfected before being assigned to work units. In reality, this separation was the beginning of the end, as it stripped families of the comfort of togetherness. Mothers tried to cling to their children, but guards beat them back, dragging infants from their arms. Elderly deportees struggled to keep pace, often collapsing under blows or the barking of dogs. The deception of showers served to lull the masses into compliance, preventing resistance before the truth could dawn. Few dared to resist, for violence was immediate and merciless. The very act of separation was calculated to disorient and weaken morale. At Sobibor, every order given was designed to hasten death under the cloak of falsehood. The first transports revealed how deception and brutality worked hand in hand. From the platform, the victims were herded toward the so-called undressing barracks. These wooden huts were presented as waiting areas where they could prepare for showers. SS officers ordered them to remove their clothing, promising that garments would be returned after disinfection. Signs urged cleanliness, while guards mocked those who hesitated. For women, humiliation was especially acute, as they were forced to undress in front of strangers under the eyes of jeering guards. Hair was often shorn from their heads, destined for shipment back to Germany to be woven into fabric. Men, women, and children alike folded their clothes in neat piles, clinging to the hope of retrieval. In reality, the garments were sorted for plunder, never to be seen again. The undressing barracks stripped deportees not only of their clothing, but of dignity, identity, and illusion. Naked and vulnerable, they were driven toward the final corridor. Every step deepened the deception until it closed around them completely. The path from the undressing area to the gas chambers was deceptively ordinary in appearance. Known as the road to heaven, it was lined with fences covered in branches to create a false sense of enclosure. The victims, still believing in the lie of showers, shuffled down this narrow corridor in silence, watched closely by guards. Some whispered to one another, still wondering where they were, still searching for hope in the quiet march. Mothers carried children, elderly men leaned on walking sticks, and families looked anxiously for reassurance. The quiet was broken only by the barking of dogs and the shouting of guards, urging them onward. At the end of the path stood low, nondescript buildings disguised to resemble bathhouses. Doors swung open, and the deportees were ushered inside, packed tightly together in dark, airless chambers. The illusion dissolved only as the doors clanged shut. By then, it was too late for realization to become resistance. Inside the gas chambers, terror unfolded with mechanical finality. Victims were crammed shoulder to shoulder, pressed so tightly that movement was impossible. The room was dark, hot and suffocating, the air heavy with the panic of hundreds of people. Guards outside started the engines of a captured Soviet tank, piping exhaust fumes directly into the chambers. Within minutes, cries and screams turned into gasps, then silence. Some clawed at the walls or scratched the doors in desperation, leaving traces of their final moments. Children suffocated in their mothers' arms, elders collapsed on the floor, and panic spread until the poison claimed all within. The process was monitored by SS officers, who timed the gassing with cold detachment. Once silence fell, the doors were opened, and Sonderkommando prisoners dragged out the bodies. The gas chambers were then cleaned, ready for the next transport. Sobibor's purpose had been fulfilled for the first time. The shock of these first gassings reverberated through both victims and perpetrators. For the deportees, disbelief gave way to terror in their final moments, a realization that all promises had been lies. For the SS and guards, the event was marked not by hesitation, but by brutal indifference. Many had been trained in earlier killing operations, hardened by experience in Aktion T4 or Einsatzgruppen massacres. At Sobibor, they treated extermination as duty, carried out with clinical detachment. After the gassing, officers drank coffee, shared cigarettes, or discussed efficiency, as though mass murder were routine work. Ukrainian guards laughed and bragged, their cruelty unmasked by any pretense of civility. For the few prisoners forced into labor, the reality was unbearable. They lived on the edge of death, their survival dependent on usefulness. The first transports revealed the true character of Sobibor, not a prison, not a camp, but a factory of death. From this moment onward, its rhythm of killing would only accelerate. By the end of the first weeks of operation, Sobibor had already claimed thousands of lives. Transports continued to arrive daily, each train unloading its cargo of unsuspecting victims into the machinery of deception and annihilation. The system worked with terrifying smoothness: arrival, separation, undressing, the road to heaven, and the gas chambers. For the Nazis, the first transports confirmed that Sobibor could function as intended, killing efficiently and leaving little trace. For the Jewish communities of Lublin and beyond, it marked the beginning of total destruction, the erasure of centuries of life and culture. The forests of Sobibor filled with smoke from burning bodies, the air heavy with a stench that betrayed what the guards tried to hide. Locals began to whisper of horrors within, though few could imagine the full scale. The first transports were not an experiment but a declaration. Sobibor was open for business, and its business was death. What began in secrecy would soon consume entire nations. Sobibor's gas chambers were the heart of its killing process, and they evolved rapidly as the camp sought to increase efficiency. In the beginning, the chambers were small wooden structures, crudely constructed but lethal enough to kill hundreds at a time. The mechanism relied on engines salvaged from captured Soviet tanks, whose exhaust fumes were piped into sealed rooms. Victims, packed tightly inside, suffocated as carbon monoxide displaced the air, causing unconsciousness followed by death. The method was borrowed from earlier euthanasia experiments under Aktion T4, where gas was first tested on the disabled in Germany. At Sobibor, the same system was applied on an industrial scale, perfected through repeated use. By late 1942, the wooden chambers were replaced with brick buildings, capable of killing over 1,000 people in a single cycle. The new structures were disguised as bathhouses, with doors, chimneys, and tiled walls to complete the illusion. The architecture itself was deception, designed to pacify until the moment of death. The chambers became the silent engines of annihilation, running day after day with mechanical precision. The victims never entered the chambers aware of their fate. They were led down the road to heaven, the narrow fenced pathway that forced them forward with no possibility of return. Along the way they were told they would shower, their clothing disinfected, and their labor reassigned. Women were stripped not only of their clothing but of their hair, which was shorn to be sent back to Germany as industrial material. The deception was critical, for panic could disrupt the process, and the Nazis sought smooth efficiency. Guards shouted, dogs barked, and the masses were hurried forward, disoriented and compliant under pressure. Inside the chambers, bodies were crammed together, standing room only, filling the small space to its limit. When the doors slammed shut, darkness and suffocation engulfed them. Cries turned to screams, then gasps, then silence, as the exhaust engines pumped poison inside. Minutes later, the chamber was quiet, filled not with life, but with silence and death. The process, though horrifying, was repeated without pause, again and again. Once the victims had been murdered, another unit of prisoners, the Sonderkommando, was forced to handle the aftermath. These labor units were composed of Jewish prisoners selected upon arrival, spared from immediate death only because they could serve the machinery of extermination. Their work was among the most horrific imaginable, removing bodies from gas chambers, cleaning the floors and preparing the space for the next group. They dragged corpses into pits, stripped them of gold teeth and valuables, and stacked them in neat arrangements for burial or burning. The prisoners worked under constant guard, beaten savagely if they faltered or resisted. They knew their survival was temporary, for once they weakened or new workers arrived, they too would be sent to the gas. The Sonderkommando lived in a state of daily torment, caught between survival and complicity. Their lives were prolonged only as long as their labor was useful. Sobibor's killing process depended on their forced participation, making the victims themselves instruments in the machinery of death. It was cruelty layered upon cruelty, designed to erase hope and humanity alike. Disposal of bodies at Sobibor was initially handled through mass graves, dug in the surrounding woods and pits within the camp. After each gassing, prisoners dragged corpses into these pits, stacking thousands beneath the soil. The stench of decomposition quickly spread through the area, overwhelming guards and locals alike. To combat this, the Nazis turned to burning, learning from experiences in other camps. Giant pyres were built from iron rails, laid across stone supports, upon which bodies were stacked in layers and doused with fuel. Fires roared for days, belching smoke and ash into the sky, covering the camp in a haze of death. The shift from burial to burning also served another purpose. It erased evidence, leaving no mass graves to testify to the crimes. The pyres consumed not only the dead, but the possibility of future discovery. Sobibor became a crematorium in all but name, its furnaces built in the open air of the forest. Fire became the final chapter in the cycle of destruction. The daily rhythm of Sobibor revolved around trains, each one heralding another wave of death. In the morning, a transport would arrive, sometimes carrying hundreds, sometimes thousands, of deportees. Guards and officers sprang into action, dividing, deceiving, and driving the victims toward their fate. By midday, the gas chambers were filled, the engines running, the screams muffled behind wooden and brick walls. By afternoon, the Sonderkommando dragged the bodies out, stripped them, and prepared them for burning. The next transport often arrived the same day, and the cycle repeated. Day after day, week after week, the camp pulsed with the rhythm of extermination. The guards treated it as routine, their days marked by schedules of murder as though they were managing a factory. Coffee breaks, meals, and moments of rest punctuated the killings, reducing atrocity to normal labor. Sobibor functioned not as chaos but as order, a place where death was as scheduled as a train timetable. Its machinery was relentless, indifferent, and constant. The SS officers overseeing Sobibor were both engineers and executioners of this process. They monitored the gas chambers, kept records, and ensured efficiency in the killing operations. For them, extermination was not an act of passion but a professional duty carried out with cold calculation. Officers like Gustav Wagner and Karl Frenzel enforced discipline with sadistic brutality, beating prisoners to maintain fear and obedience. Yet outside the killing zones, they lived comfortably, eating well, drinking, and enjoying leisure. This split reality, murder by day, comfort by night, was sustained by their ideology and detachment. To them, the gas chambers were tools and victims were numbers. Sobibor's efficiency was a reflection of their mindset, the transformation of genocide into a managerial task. Every death was a result of deliberate planning, not chance. The officers became custodians of death, maintaining the machinery with loyalty to the Nazi cause. Their indifference was as deadly as their brutality. The Ukrainian guards, trained at Trawnicki, played a crucial role in the daily rhythm of extermination. They herded victims from trains, enforced order at the undressing barracks, and drove them along the road to heaven. Armed with rifles, whips, and dogs, they ensured compliance through fear and violence. For many, cruelty became routine, their brutality escalating as they grew accustomed to their roles. They assisted in shootings, beatings, and executions of prisoners deemed unfit for work. Their presence amplified the terror of the camp, adding another layer of dehumanization. These guards lived in their own barracks, separated from the SS, but integrated into the killing machine. Their loyalty was rewarded with food, alcohol, and privileges, reinforcing their complicity. At Sobibor, their role was indispensable, providing the manpower that allowed a handful of SS officers to oversee mass extermination. The machinery of death relied on them as much as it did on engines and chambers. By the end of 1942, Sobibor's machinery of death was operating at full capacity, a perfected system of extermination. Trains arrived regularly, chambers filled, bodies burned, and ashes scattered into the wind. The camp functioned like a factory, each part contributing to the cycle of killing. For the victims, the process was swift, leaving little time for realization, resistance, or hope. For the perpetrators, it was routine, their days measured not in hours but in lives extinguished. The Sonderkommando, caught between survival and horror, labored under the shadow of inevitable death. Sobibor had become a place where life ended with mechanical certainty, where deception and violence fused into one seamless operation. The camp's evolution into an efficient killing center marked the peak of Operation Reinhard's ambition. Sobibor was no longer just a camp hidden in the forest. It was a machine that consumed human lives at an industrial pace. And in its silence, the machinery of death never faltered. At the top of Sobibor's command structure stood men whose names would later be remembered with infamy: Franz Stangl, Franz Reichleitner, Gustav Wagner, and Karl Frenzel. Each played a pivotal role in shaping the camp into a place where extermination was conducted with brutal efficiency. They were not random men plucked from obscurity, but officers selected for their loyalty, experience, and ruthlessness. Many had previously worked in Action T4, the Nazi euthanasia program that murdered the disabled in Germany, where they perfected the use of gas chambers and mass killings. Sobibor was in many ways an extension of that earlier training, carried from hospitals into the forests of Poland. Stangl, Reichleitner, Wagner, and Frenzel were bound by a shared culture of obedience and ideology. Their purpose was not only to oversee operations, but to ensure the camp functioned without disruption, regardless of the human cost. They supervised deportations, commanded guards, and punished prisoners with merciless violence. Their presence instilled fear not only among victims but also among those forced into labor. Together they formed the iron fist that kept Sobibor running. Franz Stangl was among the first commandants of Sobibor, a man who embodied the cold detachment of Nazi bureaucracy. Trained in law enforcement, he had served as a police officer in Austria before joining the SS. His experience in Extune T4 made him a valuable asset, as he had already overseen gas chambers in Hartheim, one of Germany's killing centers. At Sobibor, Stangl brought an administrator's mentality to extermination, treating genocide as managerial duty. He rarely dirtied his own hands, but ensured that every system ran smoothly, from transports to gassings to the sorting of possessions. Survivors described him as impeccably dressed, polite even, yet utterly devoid of humanity. To Stangl, the victims were numbers, units to be processed through a machine. His calm demeanor masked an inner cruelty, a willingness to murder by order rather than impulse. After his time at Sobibor, he was transferred to Treblinka, where he commanded operations that killed hundreds of thousands more. His career illustrates how bureaucracy and genocide became inseparable. Stangl was a manager of mass murder, efficient and emotionless. Following Stangl's transfer, Franz Reichleitner assumed command of Sobibor, bringing with him an even harsher regime. Reichleitner was another veteran of Action T4, steeped in the culture of mechanized killing. Unlike Stangl, who cloaked his actions in formality, Reichleitner was openly brutal, quick to use violence and intimidation. He ruled Sobibor with iron authority, instilling terror not only in prisoners, but also in the Ukrainian guards who served under him. Survivors remembered his cold gaze, his short temper, and his complete indifference to suffering. Under Reichleitner, punishments for minor infractions became more severe, executions more frequent, and the pace of killing more relentless. His command coincided with Sobibor's peak efficiency, when transports from across Europe poured into the camp. Reichleitner was described as a man who carried out his duties with fanatical loyalty to Himmler's orders. He embodied the SS ideal, ruthless, obedient, and efficient. In Sobibor, his presence ensured that death remained constant, unbroken by hesitation or doubt. He was not only a commander, but an overseer of annihilation. Gustav Wagner, Sobibor's deputy commandant, was perhaps the most feared man in the camp. Nicknamed the Beast, Wagner was infamous for his sadism, taking personal pleasure in tormenting prisoners. He was tall, physically imposing, and carried himself with the swagger of a man who knew his power was absolute. Survivors recalled him smiling during executions, beating prisoners to death, or setting his dogs upon them for sport. His cruelty went beyond duty, transforming violence into entertainment. He devised humiliating punishments, forcing prisoners to perform degrading tasks before killing them. Wagner's brutality was unpredictable, keeping prisoners in a constant state of terror, never knowing when death might come. Despite his sadism, he was also efficient, ensuring that the camp's machinery of death ran without interruption. His presence loomed over every part of Sobibor, a figure of terror etched into the memory of those who survived. To encounter Wagner was often to encounter death. He embodied the merciless cruelty that defined Sobibor's daily life. Karl Frenzel, one of the longest-serving SS officers at Sobibor, also played a central role in the camp's operation. Frenzel oversaw work details and the prisoner barracks, ensuring that forced laborers carried out tasks essential to the camp's efficiency. Though not as sadistic as Wagner, he was still remembered as brutal, enforcing discipline through beatings and executions. He often supervised selections, deciding who would be temporarily spared for labor and who would be sent directly to the gas chambers. Frenzel exploited this power to instill fear, reminding prisoners that their survival depended on his whim. He participated in shootings, hangings, and the punishment of escape attempts, ensuring terror remained constant. Yet, like many SS men, he rationalized his role as obedience to orders, presenting himself as a cog in a larger machine. In reality, Frenzel's authority shaped the daily rhythm of cruelty and despair in Sobibor. He was the overseer of misery, ensuring that no prisoner forgot the power of the SS. His control over the living ensured that death always remained near. The SS men could not have operated Sobibor alone. Their power was amplified by the Ukrainian Trawniki guards, who enforced their orders with brutal zeal. These men, recruited primarily from Soviet POW camps, were trained at Trawniki near Lublin before being deployed to the Reinhard camps. Many were motivated by survival, offered food, shelter, and status in exchange for loyalty to the Germans. Once at Sobibor, they became indispensable, serving as the muscle of the camp's daily operations. Armed with rifles, whips, and dogs, they forced deportees from trains, herded them along the road to heaven, and guarded the gas chambers. Their cruelty was notorious, often rivaling that of the SS themselves. They beat prisoners savagely, executed escapees, and participated in mass shootings with little hesitation. For the SS, the Trawniki guards were a force multiplier, enabling a small number of Germans to control thousands of victims. For the prisoners, they were a constant presence of terror, enforcing obedience through random violence. Sobibor's machinery of death relied as much on them as on the chambers themselves. The daily routine of Sobibor was shaped by the personalities of these men. Stangel's bureaucratic efficiency, Reifleitner's harsh authority, Wagner's sadism, and Frenzel's control blended into a system of absolute domination. The SS officers oversaw operations from a distance, issuing orders and monitoring results. The Ukrainian guards carried out the brutal details, ensuring the victims were processed swiftly. Together, they created an environment where cruelty was both structural and personal. For the victims, this meant that suffering came not only from the machinery of extermination, but from the whims of men who wielded unchecked power. A prisoner could be killed for pausing too long, for glancing in the wrong direction, or for no reason at all. The guards' laughter and casual violence reinforced the sense of helplessness. Sobibor was not just a system of killing, it was a culture of cruelty. The personalities of its commanders and guards shaped its horror as much as its fences and chambers. In retrospect, the men who commanded and guarded Sobibor were not extraordinary figures, but ordinary men molded by ideology and circumstance into instruments of mass murder. They were policemen, soldiers, and opportunists who found themselves in positions of absolute power over the powerless. Their loyalty to the Nazi cause, combined with personal cruelty, ensured that Sobibor operated with ruthless efficiency. Survivors remembered their faces, their voices, their habits, long after the camp was gone. These men were the embodiment of a system that dehumanized not only its victims but its perpetrators. They transformed Sobibor into a place where death was routine, cruelty was normal, and indifference reigned supreme. Their legacy is written in the ashes of those they killed and in the testimonies of those who lived. The SS officers and Trawniki guards were the human engines of the camp's machinery of death. Without them, Sobibor would have been an empty forest clearing. With them, it became one of the darkest places in human history. For most who arrived at Sobibor, life ended within hours, but for a small minority, survival meant being chosen for forced labor inside the camp. These prisoners were spared not from compassion but from necessity, selected to keep the machinery of extermination running. They became part of the Sonderkommando or other work details, living on borrowed time. Their barracks stood inside the camp, crowded, filthy and cold, surrounded by fences that reminded them daily of their captivity. The huts were simple wooden structures, packed with bunks that left no space for privacy. Straw served as bedding, crawling with lice, and the air was filled with the stench of sweat and sickness. Food was scarce, little more than watery soup, stale bread, and occasional scraps from the SS kitchens. Starvation was constant, weakening bodies while guards demanded endless labor. Disease spread rapidly, unchecked by medicine or hygiene. The daily life of a prisoner was not about living, but about surviving one more day in the shadow of death. Sobibor's prisoners lived in a camp divided into distinct zones, each reinforcing the separation between life, labor, and death. The living area housed the SS and Ukrainian guards, comfortably distant from the suffering they oversaw. The prisoners' barracks stood nearby, yet cut off by fences and armed watchtowers that reminded them of their powerlessness. Beyond lay the extermination zone, where gas chambers and burning pits consumed thousands daily. Prisoners forced into labor were never allowed near these zones unless their work demanded it. Those who did, particularly the Sonderkommando, lived with the knowledge that they were one step closer to death. Separation between zones also served to disorient prisoners, ensuring they never saw the camp as a whole. Each group lived in its own confined world, unable to grasp the full scale of operations. For the SS, this division was deliberate, fragmenting both knowledge and resistance. Sobibor's layout mirrored the Nazi system itself, divided, controlled, and designed to erase unity. Forced labor defined the lives of Sobibor's prisoners, consuming their energy and breaking their bodies. Some were assigned to sort clothing and belongings, stripping valuables from the possessions of the murdered. Others were forced to cut hair from women before they entered the gas chambers, or to wash and repair stolen garments for shipment to Germany. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and tailors were exploited for their skills, repairing camp infrastructure or producing goods for guards. The most horrific work fell to the Sonderkommando, who removed bodies from gas chambers, pulled out gold teeth, and dragged corpses to mass graves or pyres. This labor was carried out under constant watch, with guards beating or killing those who slowed down. Prisoners worked from dawn until nightfall, exhausted and starving, only to return to barracks filled with despair. The labor was not meant to sustain life, but to sustain death, ensuring the extermination machine never faltered. Sobibor's prisoners lived not as workers, but as extensions of the camp itself. Their survival was tethered to their usefulness in destruction. Starvation and humiliation were tools of domination used daily against Sobibor's prisoners. Rations were deliberately meager, leaving most perpetually hungry and weak. Guards mocked their suffering, sometimes tossing scraps of food only to snatch them away or throw them to dogs. Thirst was another weapon, with prisoners often denied water during long work details under the sun. Hunger gnawed not only at the body, but at dignity, reducing once proud individuals to desperate scavengers. The SS and Ukrainian guards exploited this, using food as both punishment and reward. A crust of bread might mean compliance, while starvation was the price of defiance. Humiliation went hand in hand with deprivation, as prisoners were forced to sing while working, dance under threat of beating, or crawl on the ground like animals. These rituals stripped them of humanity, reinforcing the illusion of superiority among the perpetrators. Starvation and humiliation were not incidental. They were calculated to crush resistance. The prisoners lived in a world where hunger and degradation were constant companions. The psychological torment of Sobibor was as devastating as physical suffering. Prisoners lived in constant fear, aware that death could come at any moment without warning. The randomness of executions instilled terror, as guards killed for sport or on whim, keeping prisoners in a state of perpetual anxiety. They heard the cries of the dying, smelled the stench of burning bodies, and saw the smoke rising from pyres. Every sense reminded them of the fate that awaited. For the Sonderkommando, the torment was doubled, for they were forced to participate in the destruction of their own people. They carried the weight of guilt, even though survival left them no choice. Nights brought no peace, as prisoners huddled in overcrowded huts, plagued by lice, exhaustion, and nightmares. The psychological pressure fractured spirits, making many resigned to inevitable death. Yet in the depths of despair, some clung to small sparks of resistance, refusing to surrender their humanity completely. Sobibor was a prison of the body, but even more, it was a prison of the mind. Despite the crushing conditions, small acts of resistance emerged as lifelines of dignity. Prisoners whispered prayers, keeping alive the memory of their faith and traditions. They shared scraps of bread, risking punishment to sustain one another in solidarity. Smuggled items, like a hidden knife or piece of cloth, became symbols of defiance, tiny gestures that reminded them they were still human. Some carved secret markings into barracks walls, a silent testimony for the future. Others sang songs, defying the silence of the camp, with voices that refused to be extinguished. Even in forced labor, some slowed their pace, subtly resisting the efficiency demanded by the SS. Though seemingly small, these actions mattered, for they kept alive the spirit of resistance in a place designed to extinguish it. Prisoners found meaning in these moments, reminding themselves that they were more than victims. Resistance at Sobibor was not only about escape, but about survival of the soul. Each act, however minor, was a refusal to let cruelty define them. Community among prisoners was fragile but vital, providing strength in the face of relentless brutality. Bonds formed quickly, often among those assigned to the same labor detail or barrack. Older prisoners looked after the young, while those with skills shared them to increase the chance of survival. Stories were told in whispers, passing fragments of memory from one generation to another. These connections reminded prisoners that they were not alone, even in the heart of annihilation. The SS sought to break this unity, separating families, punishing groups for individual acts, and fostering mistrust. Yet solidarity persisted, as sharing and empathy became silent acts of rebellion. Within the barracks, conversations about the outside world offered fleeting hope, a reminder of life beyond the fences. The existence of such bonds proved that even in Sobibor's darkness, human connection could not be fully extinguished. The camp reduced prisoners to numbers, but within themselves they remained human. Daily life for prisoners at Sobibor was a constant negotiation between despair and defiance. They endured starvation, humiliation, and forced labor, their days marked by endless suffering and uncertainty. Yet within this crushing existence, they found ways to assert fragments of humanity, whether through solidarity, secret prayers, or small gestures of resistance. The separation of zones ensured they lived divided lives, cut off from the full knowledge of the camp's scale, yet always haunted by the smoke and screams that surrounded them. Psychological torment bore heavily, with the knowledge that death was inevitable for nearly all. But it was precisely under these conditions that the seeds of later resistance took root. Sobibor was designed to erase individuality and hope, but the prisoners' persistence proved that even in the face of extermination, humanity could endure. Life inside the camp was unbearable, yet survival carried its own weight of witness. These survivors would later become the voices that exposed Sobibor's crimes to the world. Their daily suffering laid the foundation for future rebellion. Sobibor was not only the destination for Jews from Poland, but also for victims deported from across Europe, its reach extending far beyond the forests of Lublin. From 1942 to 1943, trains brought Jews from the Netherlands, France, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union, funneling them into the camp's machinery of death. Each transport represented the destruction of communities that had existed for centuries, uprooted in a matter of days. From Amsterdam to Paris, from Prague to Minsk, families were rounded up in ghettos, synagogues, and city squares before being crammed into cattle cars. The Nazis presented these deportations as resettlement, spreading false assurances that work awaited in the East. In reality, Sobibor offered nothing but immediate death for nearly all who arrived. The diversity of origins meant that languages, traditions, and cultures converged briefly in Sobibor before being extinguished. Jews from Western Europe arrived alongside those from rural Polish villages, united only by their fate. The camp became a meeting point of suffering on an unprecedented scale. Its reach demonstrated that Sobibor was not a local atrocity, but part of a continent-wide extermination. From Poland itself came the largest number of victims, drawn primarily from the Lublin district and surrounding areas. Entire ghettos were liquidated with military efficiency, as families were forced from their homes and herded into trains under the watchful eyes of German police and Ukrainian auxiliaries. Villages that had been vibrant centers of Jewish life for centuries were emptied in a matter of hours. Communities like Izbica, Chelm, and Zamość disappeared from the map, their populations sent directly to Sobibor. The process was brutal. Children crying, elders struggling, families carrying whatever belongings they could grasp. Deportees often believed they were being relocated to labor camps, as the Nazis spread lies to prevent panic. The illusion held until the cattle car doors clanged shut, sealing them into darkness. For Polish Jews, Sobibor was the final stage of a campaign that had begun with ghettos and forced labor. Their deportations formed the backbone of the camp's extermination. The forests of eastern Poland became the graveyard of their centuries-old presence. From the Netherlands came one of the largest contingents of Western European Jews sent to Sobibor. Beginning in March 1943, trains departed from the Westerbork transit camp, carrying thousands to their deaths. Families from Amsterdam and other Dutch cities, who had lived lives of relative integration before the war, now faced the full brutality of Nazi extermination policy. Many were deceived by the efficiency of deportation, believing in the promise of resettlement because the Nazis maintained order and control. Dutch Jews often carried letters, official documents, and neatly packed luggage, unaware they would never see their possessions again. Over 34,000 Dutch Jews were murdered at Sobibor, making them one of the largest groups of foreign victims. Their arrival was remembered by survivors as particularly tragic, as many could not imagine the reality awaiting them. The sudden collapse of Dutch Jewish life revealed the global reach of Sobibor's killing program. The camp consumed not only those from the East, but also those from Western Europe. Its victims reflected the entire geography of occupied Europe. France too felt the pull of Sobibor's machinery of death, though fewer in number compared to Poland and the Netherlands. Jews rounded up in occupied France, often in infamous raids like the WW2 roundup in Paris, were dispatched eastward in convoys of cattle cars. Many were sent first to transit camps like Drancy, before being pushed further east toward Sobibor. Families who had lived for generations in French cities found themselves reduced to numbers on a deportation list. The journey was long and harrowing, with deportees enduring days of suffocation, thirst, and hunger. Mothers comforted children with empty reassurances, while elders slumped in exhaustion on the wooden floors of the cars. When trains finally reached Sobibor, survivors of the journey were too weak to resist or comprehend their fate. Within hours, French Jewish life that had taken centuries to build was extinguished in the chambers. Though smaller in scale, The deportations from France symbolized the reach of Sobibor's grasp across Western Europe. Its victims carried stories of urban culture, assimilation, and faith, all consumed in the camp's fire. Czechoslovakian Jews also made their way to Sobibor, their deportations part of the systematic destruction of Central European Jewry. Many were sent first to ghettos such as Theresienstadt, the so-called model ghetto used for Nazi propaganda, before being transferred to killing centers. The promise of Theresienstadt as a resettlement site was a cruel lie designed to calm international observers. From there, transports headed east, carrying families to Sobibor under the guise of relocation. Among them were educated professionals, artisans, and religious leaders, representing the diverse fabric of Czech Jewish life. The trains carried them across hundreds of miles, only for their lives to end within hours of arrival. Some survivors recalled seeing confusion in the eyes of these deportees, who could not comprehend the brutality awaiting them. Sobibor became the endpoint for their journey, the forest swallowing their voices and their history. Czechoslovakia's Jewish communities, once vibrant and proud, vanished into the smoke rising from Sobibor's pyres. Their memory lingers as testimony to the camp's continental reach. Perhaps most tragic were the deportations from the Soviet Union, as Red Army Jewish prisoners and civilians alike were sent to Sobibor. Many Soviet Jews had already endured pogroms, occupations, and the brutality of Einsatzgruppen massacres. Yet for those who survived long enough to be deported, the journey to Sobibor was another cruel chapter. Soviet POWs, weakened by starvation and mistreatment, were singled out and sent eastward, arriving at Sobibor already on the edge of death. Civilians from Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia were also swept into the deportation system, forced into cattle cars alongside their neighbors. The distances traveled were immense, journeys that lasted over a week in conditions of suffocating heat or freezing cold. By the time the trains reached Sobibor, many passengers were dead, their bodies discarded along the tracks or left in the wagons. The survivors of these journeys staggered into the camp, too weak to resist as guards herded them toward the gas chambers. Sobibor thus became a grave for both civilians and soldiers, its reach extending into the very heart of the Soviet Union. The train journeys themselves were ordeals of unimaginable cruelty, a prelude to death before Sobibor's gates. Prisoners were crammed into cattle cars with no windows, little ventilation, and no space to sit or lie down. Buckets served as toilets, overflowing quickly in the sweltering heat or freezing cold. Hunger gnawed at passengers, thirst drove them to lick condensation from the walls, and disease spread unchecked in the cramped conditions. Infants wailed until their cries faded, elders collapsed and never rose again, and mothers tried desperately to shield children from despair. Days stretched endlessly, the air thick with sweat and desperation, until the wheels finally screeched to a halt at Sobibor. Survivors of the journey stumbled out into blinding light, gasping for air, but unaware that their ordeal was far from over. The cattle car was itself a coffin on wheels, designed to weaken and demoralize before the final stage. For many, the train ride was the cruelest deception of all. It delivered them to death while pretending to carry them to life. The journey and the destination together became a chain of annihilation. On the arrival platform, families were torn apart in scenes of chaos and despair. Mothers were separated from children, husbands from wives, the elderly from the young. Guards barked orders, striking those who resisted or hesitated. Dogs lunged at the terrified deportees, adding to the panic. Some children were dragged screaming from their parents, clutching desperately until beaten apart. The deception of showers persisted, but the heartbreak of separation revealed the cruelty of the lie. For many, this was the final moment they saw their loved ones alive, their last words drowned out by the shouts of guards and the cries of the crowd. Within hours, families that had shared generations of life together were extinguished in the gas chambers. The platform at Sobibor became a place of rupture, where lives, histories, and legacies were split forever. Every transport brought not just individuals but entire communities to their end. From the moment the trains rolled into Sobibor, deception was woven into every detail of the victim's experience. The arrival platform was constructed to resemble a modest railway station, complete with painted signs, neat gravel, and even flower pots arranged to suggest normalcy. Wooden boards bore the names of fictitious destinations, reinforcing the illusion that Sobibor was a temporary stop on a journey eastward. The SS designed this facade deliberately, knowing that fear could trigger panic and resistance. To the weary deportees stumbling from cattle cars, the scene offered a fleeting sense of relief. After days in suffocating wagons, the sight of order, signs, and flowers suggested a return to routine. Guards shouted commands, but the setting seemed less threatening than the chaotic ghettos they had left behind. Mothers calmed their children with whispers that the worst was over, while men told themselves they were headed to work camps. The appearance of a railway station cloaked the camp's true nature. In Sobibor, hope itself became a weapon in the hands of the SS. The Nazis perfected deception as a tool of domination, understanding that false hope subdued resistance more effectively than raw terror. Deportees were told they were being resettled in the east, part of a grand relocation scheme. Officials in ghettos repeated these lies before the deportations, sometimes even distributing forged work permits to maintain calm. Upon arrival at Sobibor, the story continued. Families were instructed to hand over their luggage for safekeeping, assured they would be reunited with it after showers. The guard's tone, though harsh, carried an air of authority that discouraged questions. For victims desperate to believe in survival, these assurances offered a fragile comfort. Many clung to the idea that hard labor awaited them, not immediate death. The SS capitalized on this natural human instinct to hope, allowing the process of extermination to unfold with minimal struggle. Deception was not incidental but central to Sobibor's design. It was the invisible weapon that kept thousands compliant until the very end. The facade of showers and disinfection was one of the cruelest lies woven into Sobibor's daily routine. After being separated from their belongings, deputies were told they would undergo cleansing before beginning new lives in labor camps. Signs pointed to baths, and prisoners were ordered to undress in barracks that mimicked changing rooms. Soap and towels were sometimes handed out, further deepening the illusion. The guards demanded neatness, insisting clothing be folded in orderly piles for later retrieval. To the victims, this suggested a return, a continuity of life beyond this moment. Mothers reassured children that the ordeal was temporary, while fathers imagined the showers as preparation for labor. The reality that the bathhouses were gas chambers remained hidden until the final moment. The cruelty of the lie was not only in its deception, but in its efficiency. Calm victims were easier to manage, easier to kill. The promise of showers lulled them into surrender. It was hope weaponized into a tool of annihilation. Even the smallest details of Sobibor's deception revealed the precision of Nazi planning. Flower beds were planted near the platform, tended by prisoners forced to maintain their appearance. The colorful blooms, so out of place in a death camp, softened the edges of brutality and disguised the truth. Notices and signs painted on wood instructed deportees where to go, mimicking the organization of a functioning transit camp. Guards sometimes behaved with an air of forced civility, addressing prisoners in formal tones before reverting to cruelty once the process advanced. These touches of normalcy distracted victims from the machinery of death looming beyond the fences. The juxtaposition of flowers and violence, signs and lies, reflected the camp's grotesque duality. To the deportees, such details meant safety; to the perpetrators they meant control. Deception became as much a part of the architecture as the gas chambers themselves. In Sobibor, illusion was a wall stronger than any fence. It confined hope until it was no longer needed. The deception extended beyond structures into the very choreography of the arrival process. Deportees were rushed from the trains, barked at by guards, but steered along paths that seemed orderly and logical. They were told where to leave luggage, where to assemble, where to undress, and where to walk next. The movements mirrored the routines of transit, as though one step led naturally to another. The deliberate sequence prevented panic by leaving little time for realization. Prisoners were constantly on the move, too disoriented to think, too overwhelmed to resist. Every command was designed to funnel them smoothly toward death, while the facade of order masked the truth. The guards' cruelty, though brutal, appeared disciplined, reinforcing the illusion of a system built on control rather than chaos. The deportees, exhausted from the journey, obeyed instinctively. By the time doubt set in, they were already walking down the road to heaven. The lie of resettlement carried them into the gas chambers. Survivors of Sobibor's labor units later described how the deception shaped the behavior of new arrivals. They watched as families stepped off trains with bewildered but hopeful expressions, clutching suitcases and leading children by the hand. Many asked questions about their destination, wondering aloud about work assignments, food, or shelter. Guards answered curtly, but with enough plausibility to maintain the illusion. The sight of luggage being neatly stacked convinced many that they would see their belongings again. The presence of showers and signs seemed to confirm that hygiene, not death, awaited them. Even the act of folding clothes was a deception, reinforcing the false promise of retrieval. Witnessing this process, survivors recalled the unbearable pain of knowing the truth, but being powerless to warn others. To cry out would mean immediate execution. The deception trapped not only the new arrivals, but also those already enslaved within the camp. It silenced voices as effectively as fear itself. The effectiveness of deception minimized resistance, ensuring that Sobibor functioned with ruthless efficiency. Panic was rare, as most deportees believed until the final moments that survival was possible. Without the lies of resettlement and showers, mass hysteria could have overwhelmed guards and disrupted the killing process. The Nazis knew this, and they perfected their system to rely on illusion as much as force. Guards with dogs and rifles were terrifying, but it was the promise of life after showers that subdued the majority. Resistance required awareness, and Sobibor's design ensured awareness came too late. Victims were denied the chance to organize, to fight back, or even to fully comprehend. The result was a steady flow of human beings into chambers disguised as safety. Deception was the invisible glue that held the machinery of Sobibor together. It turned victims into compliant participants in their own destruction. In the end, Sobibor's greatest cruelty was not only in its killings, but in the false hope it offered along the way. The flowers, the signs, the promises of resettlement, all were part of a performance staged to disarm human instinct. The victims, weakened by the journey and desperate to believe in survival, became actors in a play written for their destruction. The SS knew that hope could be manipulated more effectively than fear, and they wielded it with devastating skill. The deception did not soften death, it sharpened it, making the final realization all the more horrifying. For survivors, the memory of these lies remained etched as deeply as the memory of violence. Sobibor's legacy is one not only of brutality, but of calculated illusion. The camp proved that propaganda could kill as surely as bullets or gas. Its lies consumed families as surely as its chambers. In Sobibor, hope itself was murdered. In a place designed to erase identity and memory, the prisoners of Sobibor clung desperately to traces of humanity. The camp's machinery of death sought to reduce them to nameless bodies, stripped of dignity and hope. Yet even within the fences, amid hunger, fear, and brutality, prisoners found ways to assert their existence. Cultural and spiritual resistance became lifelines, fragile but powerful, that reminded them they were more than victims. They prayed in whispers, sang songs under their breath, and shared stories of the lives they had left behind. Each act, though small, carried immense weight, a quiet defiance against a system intent on obliteration. For those who survived longer within Sobibor, these moments of humanity provided strength to endure another day. They offered comfort in the face of despair and unity in the face of division. The Nazis built Sobibor to destroy, but they could not extinguish the human spirit entirely. Within its barracks, humanity endured like a faint but unbreakable flame. Religion, though dangerous to practice openly, remained a vital source of resistance for many prisoners. In the evenings, as the guards relaxed in their quarters, whispers of prayers drifted through the barracks. Jewish men quietly recited the Shema, while women whispered psalms or fragments of blessings remembered from childhood. During moments of pause in forced labor, prisoners carved out seconds of sacred time to close their eyes and connect with their faith. Holidays were observed in secret, even when exact dates could only be guessed. A scrap of bread might become matzah for Passover, while a hushed blessing transformed ordinary moments into rituals of meaning. These acts carried enormous risk. Discovery could mean brutal punishment or death. Yet the very act of prayer, whispered into the night, restored dignity to lives stripped of freedom. Faith became both defiance and sanctuary, reminding prisoners of the world beyond fences and flames. In Sobibor, religion was a rebellion of the soul. Songs, too, carried strength in the darkness of Sobi. Prisoners sang softly in Yiddish, Polish, or Russian, weaving melodies that connected them to their pasts. Music became a form of memory, preserving the culture that the Nazis sought to erase. Some songs mourned lost homes, while others spoke of resilience, echoing with defiance despite their softness. Survivors later recalled how even a single verse hummed in the night could stir courage among the barracks. At times, guards forced prisoners to sing while working, mocking them by turning song into humiliation. Yet prisoners reclaimed those same melodies for themselves, transforming coercion into quiet solidarity. Songs affirmed that they were still human beings with voices, emotions, and heritage. Even a lullaby whispered by a mother to her child became an act of resistance. In a world built to silence them, music gave prisoners a way to speak. Sobibor's barracks, however grim, became resonant with hidden notes of defiance. Stories also played a role in preserving identity, told in whispers during fleeting moments of rest. Elders recounted folk tales from Jewish tradition, reminding children of values and lessons from generations past. Parents described their homes, synagogues, and towns, painting vivid pictures of lives that once flourished. Survivors later recalled how these stories transported them, if only briefly, outside the fences of Sobibor. They reminded prisoners that they were heirs to centuries of culture, not just nameless figures awaiting death. Even simple memories, descriptions of festivals, weddings, or familiar foods, sparked warmth in the cold barracks. In telling and hearing stories, prisoners reclaimed a sense of time and continuity. The Nazis wanted them forgotten. Their stories made them unforgettable. Oral memory became a form of rebellion, a refusal to let extermination erase meaning. Each whispered tale was both comfort for the living and testimony for the future. Prisoners also engaged in small symbolic rituals that gave form to their resistance. Some lit makeshift candles fashioned from scraps of cloth and grease, creating a fragile flame that illuminated faith and defiance. Others marked the Sabbath by refusing to work with full effort, risking beatings to honor sacred time. Weddings were whispered into existence, couples exchanging vows in hushed voices before witnesses who blessed them quietly. Birthdays, though rare and dangerous to acknowledge, were remembered with a song or the sharing of a crumb of bread. These rituals, tiny against the enormity of death, carried profound weight for those who performed them. They connected prisoners to traditions that stretched back generations, asserting continuity even when the future was uncertain. To participate in ritual was to claim identity, to resist the attempted erasure. The Nazis sought to destroy the soul as much as the body, but rituals defended both. In Sobibor, a spark of tradition became a shield of humanity. Acts of solidarity were another form of cultural resistance, as prisoners shared what little they had to preserve dignity and life. A crust of bread passed secretly between barracks could mean survival for another day. A sip of water offered to the weak reminded all that compassion still lived amid cruelty. Prisoners warned each other of guards' movements, helping one another avoid beatings or death. Tailors mended clothes, blacksmiths repaired tools, and carpenters created small comforts, all in service to their fellow inmates. Even laughter, rare but possible, emerged in stolen moments, offering relief from unending despair. To share in solidarity was to refuse the isolation the Nazis imposed. The SS aimed to strip prisoners of individuality and community, but bonds of care defied that purpose. Each act of kindness was both practical and symbolic, ensuring that humanity was not extinguished. Sobibor's prisoners lived in torment, yet solidarity reminded them they still belonged to one another. Compassion became resistance in its purest form. Survival strategies also took subtle forms, as prisoners sought ways to endure in the face of certain death. Some concealed food scraps, or found ways to barter small favors for better conditions. Others deliberately slowed their labor, buying moments of rest while appearing compliant. Prisoners observed the habits of guards, learning which men were more cruel, which might overlook a minor infraction. Some hid tools or weapons, planting the seeds of future resistance long before open revolt was possible. Others carved secret symbols into wood or stone, silent testaments for anyone who might one day find them. Survival also meant controlling despair, focusing on the next hour or day rather than the inevitable end. For many, survival was not about hope for escape, but about bearing witness, living long enough to tell the truth. In these small strategies lay a form of victory, however fragile. Sobibor was designed to crush resistance, but its prisoners refused to surrender completely. They carried resistance within their daily acts of survival. In the midst of starvation, forced labor, and constant death, Sobibor's prisoners proved that humanity could endure, even in the darkest places. Through secret prayers, songs, stories, rituals, and acts of solidarity, they asserted identities that the Nazis tried to erase. Each whisper of faith, each crumb of bread shared, each tale told to a frightened child became an act of defiance. These were not grand gestures, but essential ones, small sparks of light in a world of darkness. The camp was built to annihilate not only lives but memory, culture, and dignity. Yet the prisoners refused to let those things vanish without a fight. Their cultural and spiritual resistance stands as testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Sobibor destroyed bodies, but it could not destroy all that made them human. Even in the face of systematic annihilation, traces of humanity survived. These traces became the foundation for resistance that would soon erupt into open revolt. As weeks turned into months, the prisoners of Sobibor began to grasp the terrible truth No one was ever meant to leave the camp alive. At first, many clung to the belief that they were temporarily spared for labor, imagining that survival, however temporary, offered a slim chance of freedom, but over time patterns emerged that could no longer be ignored. Prisoners noticed that every transport ended in silence, with the deportees never reappearing after their walk down the road to heaven. They saw mountains of clothing, shoes, and luggage piling up in storerooms, the possessions of thousands who had vanished. The air carried the stench of burning bodies, drifting over the camp with sickening regularity. Even the most hopeful among them could not deny the evidence. Sobibor was not a transit camp, nor a work camp, it was a death camp. The realization spread quietly, whispered among barracks at night. With this grim awareness came a change of purpose. Survival no longer meant waiting, it meant planning. The growing awareness of inevitable death became the seedbed of resistance. Prisoners began to understand that their labor was only a temporary reprieve, extended until they too would be sent into the chambers. This knowledge bred a desperate determination to act before it was too late. Whispers of escape passed through work details, cautious and coded, so as not to be overheard by guards or informers. A glance exchanged, a gesture, or a hurried word while carrying clothing or tools could hold hidden meaning. Underground networks began to form, fragile at first, linking those who shared the same burning desire to defy their captors. The conversations were dangerous, for betrayal meant instant death, and spies lurked even among the prisoners. Yet slowly groups of trust took shape, bound by a shared understanding that doing nothing was not an option. The idea of resistance was no longer a dream but a necessity. Hope was reborn, not as survival, but as defiance. Early attempts at escape were clumsy and desperate, reflecting both courage and desperation. Some prisoners tried to slip away during work details outside the main compound, cutting wood or tending fields near the perimeter. A few managed to break free into the surrounding forests, but most were quickly hunted down by guards, dogs, and local collaborators. Those recaptured were executed brutally, often in front of the remaining prisoners as a warning. Others were hanged in the camp square, their deaths staged as public spectacles of deterrence. These reprisals reinforced the dangers of escape, yet they also revealed cracks in the system. Prisoners learned from each failure, noting guard routines, weak points in the fences, and the lay of the land beyond. Each attempt, even when doomed, provided knowledge that could be used later. The failures were tragic, but they sowed experience. Escape was no longer impossible. It was simply not yet perfected. The SS understood the power of fear and used brutal reprisals to maintain control. After every failed escape, guards unleashed waves of violence on the remaining prisoners. Beatings, mass executions, and starvation punishments followed swiftly, designed to crush morale. Entire work details were sometimes slaughtered for the actions of one or two escapees. The message was clear. Any attempt to defy Sobibor would result in collective suffering. Yet paradoxically, these reprisals had the opposite effect over time. Instead of breaking resistance, they deepened the prisoners' resolve. With every execution, it became clearer that death awaited them regardless of obedience. Obedience no longer guaranteed safety. It merely delayed the inevitable. This realization stripped fear of its power. The violence that was meant to silence revolt instead fanned its flames. Within the camp, the underground networks grew bolder, though still cloaked in secrecy. Leaders emerged among the prisoners, men and women who could inspire trust and coordinate planning. They organized meetings in whispers during the night, using lookouts to ensure no guard overheard. Weapons were imagined long before they were acquired, with prisoners hiding tools, sharpening scraps of metal, or smuggling nails and wires. Others studied the guards, noting routines of patrols and identifying individuals who might be vulnerable to ambush. The networks operated like a shadow camp within Sobibor, invisible to the SS but alive with determination. Each member understood the stakes. Discovery meant torture and certain death. Yet still they persisted, knowing that action, however risky, offered a chance at freedom and revenge. The underground movements kept hope alive, even in the face of annihilation. They transformed despair into strategy, and strategy into defiance. The psychological journey from victimhood to resistance was not easy. Many prisoners, weakened by hunger and trauma, struggled to summon the strength to act. Some feared that revolt would only hasten their deaths, sacrificing what little time remained. Others worried about retaliation against fellow prisoners, knowing that the SS would respond with bloodshed. Yet, as the reality of total annihilation became undeniable, these fears gave way to urgency. Better to die fighting, many reasoned, than to die naked and powerless in the chambers. Stories of courage spread quietly, inspiring others to join the cause. Each whispered affirmation, "We must act," echoed louder than the silence of despair. Resistance became not only a possibility, but a moral imperative. The seeds of revolt were planted in minds as much as in plans. Sobibor's prisoners were no longer resigned to death. They were preparing for defiance. Failed escapes, though costly, became stepping stones to the eventual uprising. Every attempt tested the limits of the camp's defenses, mapping vulnerabilities and exposing strengths. Guards became more vigilant, but so too did the prisoners become more determined. Some learned how to sabotage tools or machinery, creating small disruptions as practice for larger actions. Others began to conceal weapons more effectively, fashioning knives from workshop scraps or hiding hammers and axes meant for labor. Even conversations became training grounds, rehearsing what might one day be shouted in open rebellion. The cost was immense, as lives were lost with each failure, but these sacrifices were not in vain. They taught the survivors that resistance was not fantasy. It was possible. Sobibor's prisoners were learning through blood and suffering how to fight back. The seeds of revolt were watered by both courage and sacrifice. By the end of 1942, Sobibor was no longer a place of silent submission, but one of simmering defiance. The prisoners had recognized that their only path to life, or at least to dignity, was through revolt. Underground networks whispered of plans, escape attempts tested courage, and reprisals only strengthened resolve. Though the SS still held overwhelming power, the balance of spirit had shifted. Fear no longer paralyzed as it once had. Instead, it fueled determination to strike back. The seeds of resistance had been planted deep in Sobibor's soil, growing beneath the surface of daily torment. These seeds would take time to grow, nourished by desperation, unity, and courage. For now the revolt remained a dream, fragile and unfinished. But its roots had already spread through the camp. Sobibor's story was no longer only one of death, it was becoming one of defiance. In October 1943, a new transport arrived at Sobibor that would alter the course of the camp's history forever. Unlike previous trains packed with families from across Europe, this one carried a group of hardened men, Jewish prisoners of war from the Red Army. They had been captured by the Germans on the Eastern Front, subjected to brutal treatment, and now sent eastward into the machinery of Operation Reinhard. Their journey was long and harrowing, filled with the same suffocation and hunger that marked every deportation train. Yet these men were different, for they were soldiers, accustomed to hardship and trained in survival. Among them was a man whose presence would prove decisive, Lieutenant Alexander Sasha Pecheski. The SS expected these Soviet Jews to be broken, like all who entered Sobibor. Instead, they were about to bring a new kind of resolve into the camp. Their arrival marked not just another chapter of suffering, but the beginning of open resistance. In their footsteps, the seeds of revolt would find a leader. Alexander Pachesky was no ordinary prisoner. Born in Ukraine in 1909, he was a man of education, strength, and resilience. As an officer in the Red Army, he had been captured in 1941, enduring starvation and disease in German POW camps, before being identified as Jewish and singled out for harsher treatment. Despite these ordeals, his spirit remained unbroken, and his natural leadership qualities stood out even among his fellow soldiers. When he arrived in Sobibor, emaciated but unyielding, he immediately commanded attention. Survivors later recalled his upright posture, his piercing eyes, and his quiet authority that inspired respect. Unlike many prisoners who had grown resigned to inevitable death, Pachesky radiated determination. He saw Sobibor not as the end, but as a battlefield, a place where fighting back was still possible. His presence was like a spark in dry tinder, igniting hope among prisoners who had long believed revolt was impossible. In Pachesky, Sobibor had found its leader. From his first days in the camp, Pachesky began to study Sobibor with the eyes of a soldier. He observed the routines of guards, the layout of fences, and the daily rhythms of extermination. He asked quiet questions, listened carefully to whispers among prisoners, and built trust with those already dreaming of resistance. His military discipline gave him patience, while his experience gave him clarity. He understood that chaos alone would not topple Sobibor, only careful planning could. Within days he had recognized weaknesses, the reliance on Ukrainian guards, the limited number of SS officers, and the possibility of striking at them directly. To the despairing prisoners, his focus was electrifying. He did not speak of dying in silence, but of fighting with purpose. His presence transformed whispered defiance into concrete plans. Pachesky was not only a leader, he was a strategist, and Sobibor would soon become the stage for his daring vision. Uniting Sobibor's prisoners was no small task, for the camp was divided by fear, suspicion, and constant surveillance. The underground networks that had formed earlier were fragile, built on whispers, and easily shattered by betrayal. Pachesky approached this challenge with patience, bringing together groups that had previously operated in isolation. He met with leaders of the Jewish work details, earning their trust by sharing food, offering encouragement, and speaking with honesty. His military background gave him authority, but it was his humanity that won their respect. Survivors recalled how he treated every prisoner as a comrade, not as a subordinate, fostering unity in a place built to divide. Slowly, the underground networks began to coalesce under his guidance, transforming from scattered whispers into a coordinated plan. He emphasized discipline, secrecy, and solidarity, qualities that resonated deeply with those desperate for hope. Under Pachesky's leadership, unity began to replace fragmentation. Sobibor's prisoners were no longer scattered, they were becoming an army in the shadows. The presence of Soviet POWs also brought a new psychological energy into the camp. These men were not civilians torn from families, but soldiers accustomed to hardship and danger. They had fought the Wehrmacht, survived captivity, and endured the cruelty of Nazi rule without losing their will to resist. To the other prisoners, their courage was contagious, reminding them that defiance was still possible. The guards underestimated them, assuming Jewish soldiers were no different from other victims. But within the barracks, their discipline and resilience stood out. They carried themselves differently, speaking openly of honor, comradeship, and the duty to fight. Their stories of battlefield survival gave strength to those who had lived in fear for months. The arrival of these men shifted the camp's atmosphere from despair to determination. Sobibor's prisoners no longer saw themselves only as victims, they began to see themselves as fighters. The Soviet POWs brought not only bodies but a spirit of resistance. Pechersky quickly recognized that any chance of revolt required striking at the camp's leadership. The SS officers, though small in number, held absolute power, and their deaths could throw the camp into chaos. He began discussing with trusted prisoners the possibility of luring SS men into traps, killing them silently, and seizing their weapons. He also studied the Ukrainian guards, noting which ones were vigilant and which could be caught off guard. The plan, he insisted, would require patience and precision, not reckless violence. To prepare, prisoners began collecting tools that could be turned into weapons: axes, knives, hammers, concealed in workshops or under clothing. Meetings were held in whispers at night, each detail debated and refined. Pechersky's leadership gave the plan credibility, his military mind gave it structure. Survivors later recalled how his calm presence reassured them, even in the face of certain danger. He taught them to think not of survival alone, but of victory, however brief. The camp was no longer just a place of death, it was becoming a battlefield. The transformation of Sobibor under Pechersky's influence was profound. Before his arrival, resistance had been fragmented, weakened by fear and repeated failures. After his arrival, it became organized, purposeful, and united. He instilled discipline, reminding prisoners to keep silent, to watch one another's backs, and to trust only those directly involved. He inspired courage by speaking of freedom, not as fantasy, but as destiny. Even the most fearful prisoners began to believe that revolt was possible. Survivors later described how his leadership gave them hope in a way nothing else could. For the first time, the thought of escaping Sobibor was no longer whispered, it was spoken with determination. The SS remained powerful, the guards still cruel, but the balance had shifted. Under Pechersky's guidance, the prisoners no longer saw themselves as doomed. They saw themselves as soldiers preparing for war. The arrival of Alexander Pechersky and the Soviet POWs marked the turning point in Sobibor's history. What had once been a camp of despair became a camp of preparation. Its prisoners no longer resigned to annihilation. Pechersky's leadership united the fragmented underground, bringing strategy where there had only been whispers. His courage inspired the broken, his discipline strengthened the weak, and his vision gave shape to rebellion. The SS remained unaware of the storm brewing beneath their noses, continuing their routine of extermination. But inside the barracks, in the silence of the nights, a plan was taking root. The seeds of revolt had grown into branches, and the day of reckoning was approaching. Sobibor would no longer be remembered only as a place of death, but also as a place of defiance. In October 1943, with the arrival of Soviet POWs, the camp's fate was set. Sobibor was on the path to uprising. The idea of revolt, once a distant whisper, now took form in secret meetings hidden within Sobibor's barracks and workshops. Prisoners huddled in corners, pretending to rest or repair tools while exchanging coded words that masked their true intentions. A raised eyebrow, a nod, or a single phrase could carry layers of meaning, invisible to guards but understood by conspirators. They could not risk large gatherings, for the SS and Ukrainian auxiliaries watched everything with suspicion. Instead, discussion spread quietly, in fragments, stitched together into a hidden network of intent. Each meeting carried enormous risk, for discovery meant torture and certain death not only for the conspirators, but for all prisoners. Yet the urgency of annihilation outweighed fear, driving men and women alike to stake their lives on rebellion. With each conversation, the revolt became less an idea and more a plan. The camp's silence at night was no longer empty, it pulsed with determination. Sobibor was preparing for war within its own fences. At the center of these discussions stood Alexander Pechersky, whose military discipline gave shape to chaos. He insisted that revolt could not be spontaneous. It had to be calculated, precise, and coordinated. The plan, he explained, would require killing SS officers silently, one by one before they could raise the alarm. Once weapons were seized, prisoners would storm the gates, overwhelm the Ukrainian guards, and flee into the forest. His calm voice and measured tone carried authority, transforming fear into focus. Survivors remembered how he spoke not of death but of honor, reminding them that action was their only chance. He emphasized secrecy, urging conspirators to act as though nothing had changed during daily routines. Each detail mattered: timing, weapons, disguises, and the careful selection of targets. Pechersky's plan was not reckless. It was a soldier's blueprint for survival and revenge. Under his leadership, rebellion was no longer a fantasy, but a looming reality. Weapons were the first obstacle, for the prisoners had nothing but their bare hands against rifles, pistols, and dogs. The workshops became hidden armories, where hammers, axes, and knives were sharpened under the guise of labor. Prisoners smuggled nails, files, and scraps of metal, fashioning crude weapons concealed in clothing or hidden under floorboards. A carpenter's tool became a dagger. A blacksmith's hammer became a weapon of execution. Some bribed or distracted guards to gain access to small items that could be repurposed. The weapons were pitiful compared to the SS arsenal, but in close quarters, surprise would level the field. The conspirators knew they could not win a prolonged battle, but they could kill quickly and decisively. Tools of labor would become tools of liberation. Every sharpened blade carried both hope and dread, for it meant the line between victim and fighter had been crossed. Sobibor was arming itself in silence, preparing to strike. The strategy relied not only on weapons, but on timing and deception. The plan was to lure SS officers into workshops under the pretense of receiving new boots, coats, or tools. There, hidden prisoners would ambush them, kill them swiftly, and conceal the bodies until the moment of uprising. By staggering the killings, the conspirators hoped to eliminate key figures before suspicion arose. Once enough officers were dead and their weapons seized, the signal would be given for mass escape. It was a plan that blended cunning with desperation, relying on both stealth and speed. Survivors later recalled the tension of rehearsing scenarios silently in their minds, imagining the strikes that would determine life or death. The conspirators knew that discovery at any stage would doom them all, yet hesitation would doom them just the same. Every second of the plan had to flow like clockwork. Sobibor's revolt would rise or fall on precision. Balancing hope with risk was a constant struggle in the weeks of planning. Some prisoners hesitated, fearing that escape would fail and lead to wholesale slaughter. Others, emboldened by Pechersky's leadership, argued that death was inevitable and revolt offered at least the chance of freedom. The conspirators debated endlessly in whispers: was it better to die fighting or to wait for the chambers? Each perspective carried truth, and the decision weighed heavily on every heart. Mothers worried for their children, elders doubted their strength, yet all agreed that silence was no longer possible. Fear lingered like a shadow, but it no longer paralyzed, it sharpened resolve. Pechersky reminded them that rebellion was not only for themselves, but for the memory of those already murdered. Their uprising would prove to the world that Sobibor did not go quietly into the night. It would be both survival and testimony. Hope and risk were inseparable, bound together in the decision to rise. The conspirators faced another challenge: secrecy within a camp filled with spies and informers. The SS often exploited prisoners, rewarding those who betrayed others with scraps of food or temporary reprieves. To protect the plan, the underground movement shared information only on a need-to-know basis. Even among prisoners, trust had to be earned through whispered oaths and silent gestures. Leaders assigned specific roles: who would ambush officers, who would signal the uprising, who would lead groups toward the forest. Women played vital roles as couriers of information, passing coded messages under the guise of domestic labor. Each step forward tightened the circle of trust, but also heightened the risk of exposure. Discovery meant annihilation, not only for leaders, but for all who lived in Sobibor, yet silence held. Against all odds, the secret endured. The camp's prisoners were bound together in a pact of blood and courage. The days leading up to the planned uprising were filled with unbearable tension. Prisoners carried out their daily tasks, sorting clothing, repairing boots, dragging corpses, while inside they lived with the knowledge of what was to come. Every passing SS officer became both a threat and a target. Every guard's laugh, every barked order carried the weight of imminent danger. Yet, outwardly, the conspirators maintained their masks, pretending submission while preparing for rebellion. Nights were the most charged, as whispers confirmed details, sharpened resolve, and reminded each other of their shared purpose. Sleep was scarce, for minds replayed the plan over and over. Some prisoners wept quietly, fearing they would not survive to see freedom, while others steeled themselves with clenched fists. The camp pulsed with quiet defiance, its silence no longer born of despair, but of preparation. Sobibor had become a ticking clock, its countdown measured in whispers and pounding hearts. By October 1943, the plan of uprising stood complete: kill the SS officers, seize their weapons, storm the gates, and escape en masse into the forests. It was a plan born not of certainty, but of necessity, balanced on the edge of hope and annihilation. Every prisoner knew the risks, yet every prisoner also knew the truth. To do nothing was to die in silence. The conspirators had transformed Sobibor from a camp of despair into a camp of hidden defiance. Their weapons were crude, their numbers untrained, yet their determination was unshakable. For the first time, the prisoners saw a vision of freedom, not guaranteed, but possible. Pachersky's leadership had turned despair into courage, and courage into action. The camp that had consumed hundreds of thousands was about to face rebellion from within its own fences. The plan was ready. Sobibor's uprising was about to ignite. On the afternoon of October 14th, 1943, Sobibor appeared as it always did: prisoners toiling in workshops, guards patrolling with rifles, and smoke rising from the cremation pits. Yet beneath the surface, the camp was a powder keg, primed to explode. The plan that had been whispered for weeks was set in motion, its first steps unfolding with calculated precision. The conspirators moved calmly, disguising fear with the practiced mask of submission. Work went on as usual, but in the carpentry shop, hammers and axes had been sharpened into instruments of death. The atmosphere was electric, a strange blend of dread and anticipation. The prisoners knew that by sundown, many of them would be dead, but some might be free. For the first time in Sobibor's existence, the camp's routine was not controlled by the SS. It was controlled by the prisoners, moving silently toward rebellion. The first act of defiance came with the lure of new boots. An SS officer, lured into the workshop with the promise of fine leather, stepped inside unsuspecting. There, prisoners waited in silence, gripping hidden weapons. With one swift blow of an axe, he was struck down, his body collapsing to the floor. The sound was muffled by the walls, and his death was concealed quickly, his corpse hidden beneath planks. The killers moved swiftly, wiping blood from tools and resuming the appearance of labor. One officer down. The prisoners exchanged quick glances, hearts pounding, but they did not celebrate. There was no time. Another officer would soon follow, summoned into a tailor's shop for a fitting, where sharpened knives awaited. The revolt had begun, not with a shout, but with a whisper of steel. As the afternoon wore on, more SS men fell into carefully laid traps. Each was invited into a workshop, tricked by the pretense of boots, coats, or weapons. Once inside, they were ambushed and killed with axes, knives, or hammers, their bodies hidden before alarms could be raised. Franz Reichleitner, the camp's commandant, was absent that day, but several of his officers met their fate. The killings were swift and silent, executed with the precision Pecheski demanded. Weapons were seized, pistols, rifles, and ammunition, providing the prisoners with the means to escalate when the time came. The conspirators knew they could not kill every guard, but each assassination shifted the balance. Every fallen SS man was both revenge for the dead and hope for the living. The camp's machinery of command was beginning to unravel. The uprising was no longer a dream, it was alive. By late afternoon, the careful silence of the assassinations gave way to rising tension. Prisoners whispered to one another, waiting for the signal to storm the gates. Some continued their assigned tasks, pretending ignorance, while others gathered secretly in groups, clutching stolen weapons. The conspirators watched the clock, knowing that one misstep could doom them all. Then came the sound that broke the camp's fragile calm. A shot rang out, loud and unmistakable. One of the killings had been discovered, or perhaps an officer had resisted at the last moment. Panic rippled across Sobibor, the illusion of order shattering instantly. Guards shouted, dogs barked, and confusion spread like fire. The moment had arrived. There was no turning back. With the camp in chaos, Pecheski and his fellow leaders shouted the signal, "Forward, comrades!" to the gates. Prisoners surged from workshops and barracks, no longer hiding their defiance. Some brandished stolen rifles, others carried axes, knives, or nothing but their bare hands. They stormed the camp's central square, clashing with Ukrainian guards who scrambled to respond. Shots rang out as prisoners charged, some falling instantly under bullets, others pressing forward with furious determination. The plan of silent assassination had transformed into open battle. Women, men, and children ran together, the camp erupting in cries of freedom and terror. For many, it was the first time they dared to run toward life, not away from death. Sobibor, for the first time, was no longer controlled by the SS. It was in flames of revolt. The assault on the perimeter was desperate, chaotic, and filled with blood. Prisoners rushed the fences, hacking at barbed wire with axes and cutting tools, while others hurled themselves over in sheer desperation. Mines planted in the ground exploded as feet struck them, tearing bodies apart and sowing panic. Guards fired relentlessly from towers, mowing down escapees as they ran across open fields. Yet, despite the carnage, the surge continued, driven by the primal instinct for freedom. Some prisoners used fallen bodies to cover mines, creating paths for those behind them. Others grabbed rifles from dead guards, firing back in wild, untrained volleys. The ground was littered with blood, bodies, and torn clothing, but still the tide pushed forward. Sobibor's fences, long symbols of entrapment, were being trampled underfoot. The impossible was happening. Prisoners were breaking free. Confusion reigned not only among prisoners, but also among the SS and Ukrainian guards. With officers dead or missing, command collapsed, leaving guards unsure where to strike. Some fought fiercely, while others fled in panic, abandoning their posts. Dogs ran wild, attacking indiscriminately, while gunfire echoed across the camp. Smoke and flames rose as parts of the camp were set ablaze, either by accident or by design, further deepening the chaos. The prisoners, though untrained, fought with the fury of desperation, seizing every chance to advance. Shouts of freedom mingled with screams of pain, creating a cacophony that shook the air. The uprising was no longer organized. It was a storm of humanity against machinery. Yet in that storm lay the strength of defiance. For the first time, Sobibor was not only a place of death, it was a battlefield of the enslaved. By nightfall, hundreds of prisoners had escaped through the torn fences and into the forests beyond. Many had fallen, cut down by bullets or torn apart by mines, but others vanished into the trees, scattering in all directions. Behind them Sobibor smouldered in flames and confusion, its once rigid system of extermination shattered in a single day. The revolt did not save all. Indeed, most who escaped would later be hunted down, but it destroyed the illusion of Nazi control. The SS had built Sobibor to be a place of silence and obedience, but October 14, 1943, proved otherwise. On that day, prisoners turned despair into defiance, transforming death into rebellion. The carefully timed assassinations had lit the spark, and the mass escape fanned it into flame. Though many lives were lost, the uprising left a scar on Nazi power. Sobibor would never again function as it once had. The revolt had ignited, and history had changed forever. The moment the revolt erupted into open battle, Sobibor became a storm of chaos, fire and gunfire. Prisoners surged toward the fences, driven by a collective cry for freedom that drowned out the shouts of the SS and the barking of dogs. Guards opened fire from towers and positions along the perimeter, their bullets tearing into the charging crowd. Men, women, and children fell where they ran, their bodies crumpling under the hail of gunfire. Yet the tide of humanity did not stop. It pressed forward, trampling over corpses and shrapnel, fueled by desperation. The crack of rifles mixed with the thunder of explosions as landmines planted in the soil detonated beneath fleeing feet. Shards of metal and earth flew into the air, striking both escapees and pursuers alike. Smoke and dust clouded the camp, obscuring sight but intensifying panic. Every second was a gamble between life and death. Sobibor was no longer a camp. It was a battlefield. The fences, once impenetrable symbols of confinement, became the prisoners' last obstacle to freedom. Armed with axes, knives, and bare hands, they tore at the barbed wire, hacking and pulling until gaps were forced open. Others hurled themselves over, cutting their bodies on jagged steel, but refusing to stop. Mines exploded as escapees stumbled into death traps, but each blast created a path for those behind them. The ground shook with the thunder of explosions, screams and cries of defiance. Guards fired from towers, but the sheer volume of fleeing prisoners overwhelmed their ability to take aim. Some escapees used fallen comrades as shields, crawling over bodies to reach the openings. Others carried children in their arms, refusing to abandon them even as bullets cut the air. The barbed wire, soaked in blood, finally gave way to the surge. The fences that once imprisoned now became torn gates of defiance. Amid the chaos, acts of heroism unfolded that would be remembered by survivors long after the war. Prisoners who had seized rifles turned and fired back at guards, covering the escape of others even as they drew fire to themselves. Women armed with knives and axes struck at Ukrainian guards, buying precious seconds for comrades to run. Parents shielded children with their own bodies, absorbing bullets so the young might live. Some prisoners refused to flee until others had passed through, holding gaps in the fence at the cost of their lives. The uprising was not only a flight for survival, It was a moment of shared sacrifice, where courage burned brighter than fear. Stories of these acts, carried by the few who lived, became testimony to the resilience of Sobibor's spirit. The revolt was chaotic, but within its fury lay countless flashes of bravery. The prisoners did not run as victims alone, they ran as fighters. Their heroism lit the path to freedom through fire. Panic swept through the camp like wildfire, for not all prisoners had expected the revolt to erupt so quickly. Some froze, paralyzed by fear, unable to move as the crowd surged past them. Others ran blindly, not knowing where the fences led, or whether they ran toward safety or death. Dogs lunged into the masses, dragging down escapees while guards fired into the confusion. The air was filled with smoke, dust, and screams, disorienting even those who tried to follow the plan. Yet, in the chaos, momentum carried the majority forward, sweeping up even the hesitant. Fear became fuel, driving bodies to move faster than thought. The camp, once controlled by precision and terror, dissolved into uncontrollable disorder. For the SS, the revolt was a nightmare they had never anticipated. For the prisoners, it was chaos turned into opportunity. In panic, freedom was found. The forests of eastern Poland loomed just beyond Sobibor's perimeter, dark and forbidding, yet filled with promise. To reach them meant survival, even if only for a few days or hours. Prisoners sprinted toward the tree line, zigzagging across open ground as bullets whistled around them. Some stumbled into pits or ditches, clawing their way out as others leapt over them. The ground was littered with the dead and dying, but the living pressed forward relentlessly. The mines claimed many lives, yet they also created clouds of dust and confusion that shielded escapees. Guards fired wildly, unable to stop the flood of bodies. The forest seemed both impossibly far and tantalizingly close, every step a victory against death. Those who reached its cover vanished into shadows, swallowed by branches and undergrowth. The camp's walls had finally been breached, and Sobibor's victims were turning into fugitives. The SS and Ukrainian guards, caught between rage and confusion, attempted to regroup. Shouts echoed as they tried to form lines, but their command structure had been decimated by the assassinations earlier in the day. Some officers were already dead, their bodies hidden in workshops, while others fled in panic. As the revolt spread, the guards fired into the fleeing crowd, but could not stem the tide. Dogs were unleashed, racing after escapees into the fields, dragging some down in vicious attacks. Grenades were thrown, tearing holes into groups of fleeing prisoners. Yet for every life taken, more slipped through the chaos. The revolt was not neat, but it was relentless. The SS, masters of calculated death, were now overwhelmed by uncalculated rebellion. Sobibor was collapsing before their eyes. For the prisoners, the flight through fire was a crucible of both terror and determination. They had no maps, no supplies, and no guarantees, only the instinct to run. Families were torn apart in the frenzy, some calling desperately for loved ones lost in the smoke. Friends became separated, scattered in different directions as they sought cover. The cries of the wounded filled the air, mingling with the explosions and the barks of dogs. Yet even as despair threatened to pull them back, the momentum of the revolt carried them forward. Each runner knew they might not survive the night, but each step away from Sobibor was a step away from certain death. They were no longer prisoners. They were fugitives, rebels, and witnesses. Their flight carried with it the weight of testimony, a chance to tell the world what had happened in Sobibor. In running they claimed not only life but history. By the end of October 14th, 1943, Sobibor was transformed from a place of silence into a place of defiance. Hundreds had fled through smoke, bullets, and fire, scattering into the forests of eastern Poland. Many lay dead on the fields, cut down by gunfire or torn apart by mines, but others vanished into the wilderness, their fates uncertain. The camp itself smouldered in ruins, its fences torn, its order shattered. The revolt had not been perfect, nor had it saved all, but it had struck a blow against the Nazi machine of death. Sobibor's prisoners had done the unthinkable. They had risen, fought, and broken free. The flight through fire was both tragedy and triumph, marked by loss, but also by unprecedented courage. The camp that had consumed so many lives could no longer continue as before. The revolt had carved Sobibor's name into history, not only as a place of death, but as a symbol of resistance. Through fire, freedom had been seized. When the smoke of the revolt cleared on October 14, 1943, the raw numbers told a story of both triumph and tragedy. Around 300 prisoners had broken free from Sobibor, surging through the fences and across the minefields into the forests of eastern Poland. It was an act of mass defiance unparalleled in the history of Nazi extermination camps. But freedom came at a brutal cost. Many were gunned down by guards, their bodies falling in open fields as others trampled past them. Dozens more were torn apart by mines, their lives sacrificed in explosions that cleared paths for those behind. The ground was littered with corpses, mingling the dead with the living in a desperate flood of humanity. Some managed to reach the forest edge, but even there bullets cut them down as they disappeared into the trees. What began as a surge of 300 soon dwindled under the firestorm of death. Escape was achieved, but not without terrible loss. The forests of eastern Poland became both refuge and peril for the escapees. In the immediate hours after their flight, groups scattered in all directions, hoping to put distance between themselves and the camp. The Germans, furious at the revolt, launched swift pursuits, aided by Ukrainian guards, local collaborators, and dogs trained for the hunt. Gunfire echoed through the woods as soldiers scoured thickets and villages, shooting anyone they found. Exhausted prisoners tried to run silently, but many were weakened by starvation and wounds sustained in the escape. Some fell behind, too injured to continue, and were executed where they lay. Others sought shelter in nearby villages, only to be betrayed by locals who feared German reprisals or sought rewards. Each step beyond Sobibor was uncertain, every farmhouse or path potentially a trap. The forest promised life, but it also swallowed many in death. Freedom was not safety, it was a gamble played with every breath. The Germans' reprisals were swift and merciless, falling hardest on those who had not escaped. Around 150 prisoners remained inside Sobibor after the revolt, too weak, too fearful, or too far from the action to flee. For them the rebellion brought no salvation, only vengeance. The SS rounded them up in the days that followed, executing many on the spot. Others were interrogated brutally, tortured for information about the uprising's leaders and planners. When answers proved unsatisfactory, bullets served as the final judgment. The camp rang with cries of agony as the last groups of prisoners were massacred in retribution. Those who had chosen to stay behind, hoping for survival, found only death. Sobibor's defiance came with a brutal price. Those left inside the fences paid it with their lives. The revolt had ended the camp's silence, but it had not spared all its voices. The reprisals extended beyond the camp itself, spilling into surrounding villages and communities. German units conducted sweeps of the countryside, searching not only for fugitives, but for anyone suspected of helping them. Civilians who gave shelter faced execution, their homes burned as warnings to others. Polish peasants found themselves caught between compassion and fear, with some risking everything to hide escapes, while others turned them in to save their own families. Local collaborators, particularly those aligned with German authorities, hunted the fugitives with brutal efficiency. Posters and announcements offered rewards for capturing Jews, further tightening the noose. In this climate of terror, many escapes found themselves betrayed, not by bullets alone, but by neighbors and strangers alike. Freedom outside Sobibor came with new dangers. Every knock at a door or rustle in the forest, carrying the risk of betrayal. Survival was no longer only about escaping the SS, it was about navigating a world poisoned by fear. Despite these dangers, some fugitives fought to survive, banding together in small groups for protection. Armed with stolen rifles and axes, they trekked deeper into forests, living off roots, berries, and whatever food they could steal or beg. Some joined partisan units, linking their struggle for survival with the broader fight against the Nazis. These groups offered both safety and purpose, allowing escapes to strike back at the occupiers. Yet life as a partisan was harsh, filled with hunger, cold, and the constant threat of betrayal. Not all escapes were able to adapt. Some perished in the wilderness, succumbing to exposure or despair. For those who persevered, however, every day alive was a victory against Sobibor's legacy. They carried with them not only the memory of the revolt, but also the responsibility of testimony. In the forests of Poland, the survivors of Sobibor became fighters, witnesses, and symbols of endurance. Their struggle proved that the camp's defiance had not ended at its fences. The numbers, however, reveal the staggering cost of freedom. Of the roughly 300 who fled Sobibor, the majority were hunted down in the days and weeks that followed. Some were killed by German patrols, others betrayed by locals, and still others felled by hunger, illness, or exposure. By the end of the war, only about 50 of Sobibor's escapees were still alive. Their survival represented both a triumph and a tragedy. Triumph because they had defied a death camp, tragedy because so few remained to tell the tale. The revolt had not saved the majority, but it had saved memory itself. Those 50 survivors became living witnesses, proof that Sobibor was not a place of silent annihilation alone. They carried with them the voices of the hundreds who had died in the fields, the mines, and the forests. Survival was not only personal, it was historical. In their lives, Sobibor's defiance endured. For the Nazis, the revolt at Sobibor was both a humiliation and a revelation. They had built the camp to function in secrecy and silence, but now it had erupted into open rebellion. The escape shattered the illusion of total control, showing that even in extermination camps, resistance could not be extinguished. Furious at the revolt and determined to prevent repetition, Heinrich Himmler ordered the immediate liquidation of Sobibor. Within weeks the camp was dismantled, its buildings torn down, its grounds ploughed over to erase all trace. The Nazis planted trees over the site, turning it into a false farm to disguise its existence. Yet the very act of erasure was an admission of defeat, proof that Sobibor could no longer serve its purpose. The revolt had not only freed a few, but had ended the camp itself. Sobibor's prisoners had forced the Nazis to destroy their own creation. Defiance had triumphed, even at terrible cost. The price of freedom at Sobibor was measured in blood, sacrifice, and silence. Hundreds died in the minefields and fields, hundreds more in reprisals and hunts, and only a handful lived to see liberation. Yet their survival carried a weight far greater than numbers. It carried memory. Through them, the story of Sobibor's revolt lived on, challenging Nazi attempts to bury it beneath forests and lies. Their testimony preserved the truth of a day when victims became fighters, when despair became defiance. Sobibor's uprising was not a victory in the military sense, but it was a victory of spirit and memory. The camp's existence ended because its prisoners refused to die quietly. Their defiance proved that even in the heart of annihilation, freedom could be claimed, if only by a few. The revolt's legacy is a reminder of both the cost and the value of resistance. Sobibor paid dearly, but in its defiance it left a mark on history that could never be erased. In the weeks following the revolt of October 14th, 1943, the Nazi leadership reeled from the humiliation of Sobibor. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the final solution, was enraged that a camp built to function in secrecy and efficiency had been torn apart by its prisoners. The revolt had not only led to mass escapes, but had exposed cracks in the Nazi system of annihilation. To Himmler and his subordinates, it was unthinkable that the world might one day learn of Sobibor through survivors. The solution, in typical Nazi fashion, was to obliterate all evidence. Orders were given swiftly. Sobibor was to be dismantled, its structures destroyed, and its memory buried beneath the soil. What had once been a hub of extermination would be turned into farmland, with crops planted to disguise its past. In this way, the Nazis hoped to ensure that Sobibor would vanish from history. It was an attempt not only to erase a camp, but to silence defiance itself. The destruction of Sobibor began with methodical precision, the same cold efficiency that had once powered its killing machine. SS units oversaw the dismantling of barracks, workshops, and gas chambers, tearing down the physical heart of the camp. Wooden structures were disassembled plank by plank, while brickwork was smashed into rubble. The cremation pits, once filled with burning bodies, were leveled and covered with layers of soil. Mass graves were unearthed and the remains exhumed, burned once again to reduce them to ash. Smoke hung over the site as flames consumed the last material evidence of slaughter. Guard towers were toppled, fences pulled down, and pathways erased. The ground that had soaked up the blood of thousands was ploughed flat, leaving only scarred earth. In destroying Sobibor, the Nazis performed one final act of cruelty. They attempted to erase the very existence of those who had died there. The camp was undone with the same ruthlessness with which it had been built. To complete the illusion, the Nazis transformed the site into farmland, an act of deception as cynical as the false railway station had been. Crops were planted where prisoners had once been gassed, fields of rye and lupins covering the ground with green and gold. A farmhouse was built on the site, inhabited by a Ukrainian settler brought in to maintain the facade. To any passer-by, the area appeared nothing more than quiet countryside, its horrors hidden beneath the soil. The SS believed that, with time, the memory of Sobibor would fade into silence, buried beneath crops and lies. This tactic mirrored their actions at other Operation Reinhard camps, such as Belzec and Treblinka, which were also dismantled to conceal the truth. The Nazis understood that secrecy was their strongest ally, and erasure was their most potent weapon. To destroy Sobibor was to destroy evidence, yet the soil itself, heavy with ashes, remained a silent witness to genocide. The decision to erase Sobibor was not merely practical but symbolic. For the Nazis, the revolt had been a wound to their sense of invincibility, a reminder that even the most powerless could defy them. Dismantling the camp was both a cover-up and a punishment, an attempt to rewrite reality. It sent a message to other camps: rebellion would not be tolerated, and its traces would be obliterated. Yet it also betrayed the Nazis' fear of history, a recognition that their crimes could not withstand scrutiny. The systematic destruction of Sobibor revealed the fragility of their empire of lies. If no trace remained, they believed, then no story could be told, and no memory preserved. It was a desperate act of denial by men who had built their power on illusion and terror. The erasure of Sobibor was their final attempt to control both the present and the future, but history cannot be ploughed under so easily. The liquidation of Sobibor's remaining prisoners marked one of the final acts of Nazi vengeance. Those who had not escaped during the revolt were executed brutally, their deaths serving as the closing chapter of the camp's human presence. Skilled laborers who had been temporarily spared were also eliminated, no longer needed in a camp that was ceasing to exist. Their blood soaked the soil as the last echoes of daily life inside Sobibor were silenced forever. The camp, once filled with the cries of victims and the commands of guards, now became a barren landscape. Its silence was deliberate, engineered, and suffocating. The absence of prisoners was as much a part of the cover-up as the planting of crops. The revolt had ensured Sobibor would not continue, but it also sealed the fate of those left behind. The Nazis killed them not only out of cruelty, but to erase witnesses. Death became the final layer of secrecy. As part of the cover-up, documents and records relating to Sobibor were destroyed or concealed. Orders were issued to eliminate paperwork, transport lists, and administrative files that could reveal the scale of murder. The SS relied on oral commands and secrecy, avoiding written trails wherever possible. What little documentation survived often did so by accident, smuggled or overlooked amid the chaos of war. The destruction of records was as important to the Nazis as the destruction of buildings. Without paper, without structures, without graves, they believed Sobibor could dissolve into myth. In their arrogance, they underestimated the power of memory carried by survivors. Yet at the time, they felt confident that history itself could be falsified. The erasure of Sobibor was part of a larger campaign to bury Operation Reinhard, the deadliest phase of the Holocaust. Silence was their chosen monument. The camp would be remembered only if witnesses lived, and few had. By early 1944, Sobibor had vanished from the Nazi map, where once trains unloaded thousands of men, women, and children into death. Fields now stretched quietly under the Polish sky. The farmhouse and its tenants served as camouflage, ensuring the land appeared ordinary. Local villagers passed by without knowing, or without daring to speak, of what had stood there. The SS congratulated themselves on their deception, believing they had erased one of their greatest crimes. Yet beneath the surface the truth lingered. Ashes still mingled with the soil, bones protruded from ploughed earth, and memories haunted those who had survived. The Nazis' attempt to erase Sobibor was doomed by the very scale of their atrocity. Some horrors are too vast to disappear, too heavy for soil to conceal. The silence of the fields was a lie, and lies cannot hold forever. Sobibor lived on in memory, even as the Nazis tried to bury it. The erasure of Sobibor stands as one of the most chilling examples of Nazi deceit, an effort not just to kill but to annihilate memory itself. They destroyed buildings, burned bodies, planted fields, and silenced witnesses, believing they could erase history as easily as they erased lives. Yet the revolt had ensured that survivors carried the truth beyond the fences, a truth the Nazis could never fully suppress. In their rush to dismantle, they revealed their fear of exposure, fear of accountability, fear of memory. The silence of Sobibor was temporary, but its defiance was eternal. What Himmler sought to bury beneath fields of rye rose instead in testimonies and history books. The sight of annihilation became a symbol of resistance, because those who escaped told the world what the Nazis tried to hide. The attempt to erase Sobibor failed. Memory endured where walls fell. The camp's destruction became, paradoxically, its preservation in history. When the war ended in 1945, the ruins of Sobibor lay hidden under ploughed fields, but its story lived in the memories of the few who had survived the revolt. For them, survival meant not only life, but also the burden of testimony, of carrying the truth of a place the Nazis had tried to erase. As Allied tribunals opened across Europe, Sobior's name emerged slowly, overshadowed by larger camps like Auschwitz. Yet survivors pressed forward, determined to ensure their voices were heard. They identified guards, described daily routines of death, and recounted the uprising in harrowing detail. Their words brought Sobibor back into history, a place the Nazis had hoped would vanish forever. From these testimonies arose trials that sought to bring perpetrators to justice. The pursuit was long and uneven, plagued by politics, legal loopholes, and the sheer scale of Nazi crimes. Sobior's survivors demanded accountability. Justice, however, proved elusive. The first trials related to Sobibor were scattered across Europe in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Many lower-ranking Ukrainian guards were caught quickly, identified by survivors or by local populations who remembered their service. Some were tried in the Soviet Union, where sentences were swift and often brutal. Others slipped into obscurity, blending into displaced persons camps or assuming new identities in the chaos of post-war Europe. The SS officers, however, were harder to pin down. Many vanished into Germany's rubble, some hiding under false names, others aided by networks of sympathizers. For years, Sobibor was overshadowed by other Nazi crimes, and few resources were devoted to tracking its perpetrators. Yet whispers persisted, and survivors continued to name names. Slowly, the machinery of justice turned its gaze toward Sobibor, but time was already allowing many guilty men to fade into anonymity. Among the most infamous of Sobibor's officers was Gustav Wagner, the brutal deputy commandant, whose cruelty left scars on all who survived. Known for his sadism, Wagner was feared as much as the gas chambers themselves. After the war, he fled Europe and found refuge in Brazil under an assumed identity. For decades he lived freely, working as a mechanic, while survivors carried memories of his brutality. His existence in South America was eventually uncovered in the 1970s, sparking international outrage. Brazil arrested him in 1978, but legal complications and political resistance prevented his extradition to Israel, Poland, or Germany. Survivors testified passionately against him, describing his crimes in vivid detail. Yet Wagner escaped trial, living under house arrest until his suspicious death in 1980, officially ruled a suicide. His story epitomized the failure of post-war justice, a mass murderer who lived freely for decades, while his victims lay in unmarked graves. Another key figure, Karl Frenzel, served as one of Sobibor's most notorious SS officers. Unlike Wagner, Frenzel remained in Germany after the war, living quietly as a factory worker. For years he avoided notice, until survivor testimonies in the 1960s brought his name to investigators. Frenzel was arrested and tried in West Germany during the Hagen-Sobibor trials of 1965, where he faced charges of mass murder. Survivors gave harrowing accounts of his brutality, describing how he oversaw selections, executions, and punishments with icy efficiency. The trial revealed not only Frenzel's role, but the functioning of Sobibor itself, bringing the camp back into public awareness. Frenzel was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, a rare case of substantial justice for a Sobibor perpetrator. Yet even his conviction could not erase decades of freedom lived without consequence. His life reflected the unevenness of post-war accountability, long impunity followed by delayed judgment. The pursuit of Sobibor's guards extended into the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Among the most controversial cases was that of John Demjanjuk, a Ukrainian guard accused of serving at Sobibor. After decades of legal battles over his wartime past, Demjanjuk was finally convicted in Germany in 2011 as an accessory to the murder of 28,000 people. The trial was groundbreaking, as it established that serving as a guard in an extermination camp was sufficient grounds for guilt, regardless of direct involvement in killings. Survivors watched from the courtroom, their decades-long wait for recognition finally answered. Yet Demjanjuk, old and frail, maintained his innocence until his death in 2012. His conviction symbolized a shift in legal standards, but it came too late for most perpetrators who had already died free. For Sobibor, Demjanjuk's case stood as both a victory of principle and a reminder of decades of delay. Justice once again arrived on history's terms, not the victims. The Hagen trials of the 1960s, which included Frenzel and other SS men, marked the most comprehensive judicial reckoning with Sobibor. Dozens of survivors testified, recounting their experiences with heartbreaking detail. They described the camp's layout, its routines of death, and the uprising that shattered its silence. For many, it was the first time they spoke publicly of their suffering, their voices trembling as they relived horrors. The trials brought Sobibor into headlines, but their impact was limited. Many defendants received light sentences, some as little as a few years, despite their roles in mass murder. The German legal system often prioritized evidence of individual acts over the broader reality of extermination. Survivors left the courtroom with mixed feelings, relieved to be heard, but bitter at the insufficiency of punishment. The trials preserved testimony, but they rarely satisfied justice. Sobibor's perpetrators slipped too easily through the cracks. The uneven pursuit of justice highlighted a troubling reality. Many of Sobibor's killers escaped entirely. Dozens of Ukrainian guards melted back into the Soviet Union, where some were punished but many simply vanished into post-war chaos. SS officers like Franz Stangl, commandant of Sobibor before transferring to Treblinka, were tried years later for crimes committed elsewhere, with Sobibor only part of their indictments. Countless others never faced a courtroom, living out their days as ordinary men in post-war Europe or South America. For survivors, each unpunished life was a wound, a reminder of injustice. The Nazi system had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives in Sobibor, yet only a handful of its executioners faced meaningful trials. This imbalance revealed the limits of post-war justice, shaped by politics, Cold War divisions, and legal technicalities. Sobibor's story was told, but accountability was fractured. Silence and anonymity shielded too many. The post-war pursuit of Sobibor's perpetrators stands as both a testament to survivor resilience and a failure of international justice. Survivors carried their testimonies across continents, identifying guards, recounting atrocities, and demanding trials. Their voices ensured that names like Wagner, Frenzel, and Demjanjuk were not forgotten, even if punishment came late or not at all. Yet the overall record reveals more impunity than accountability, more escapes into anonymity than meaningful sentences. The Nazis had tried to erase Sobibor physically. Post-war failures threatened to erase it morally. Still, the survivors' persistence preserved the truth, ensuring that history remembered even when courts failed. The pursuit of justice after Sobibor was incomplete, but it kept alive the principle that no crime of such magnitude should go unanswered. Justice was imperfect, delayed, and limited, but memory endured. Sobibor's dead found their voice through survivors, even when judges faltered. The struggle for accountability became part of Sobibor's legacy. When the guns fell silent in 1945, Sobibor no longer existed as a physical place, yet it lived on in the memories of the few who had survived its revolt. These survivors carried a burden heavier than most, for they had not only escaped annihilation, but had witnessed it firsthand. Their testimonies became the lifeline through which the world would one day know of Sobibor, a camp the Nazis had tried to erase. In towns, villages, and displaced persons camps, they began to speak at first in whispers and later in written words. Memoirs, depositions, and interviews became their weapons against forgetting. Every sentence carried the weight of both trauma and duty, for silence would have been the Nazis' final victory. Among the most powerful voices was Alexander Pichesky, the Soviet officer whose leadership had made the revolt possible. His story traveled across borders, told and retold in the Soviet Union and beyond. Through his voice, Sobibor's defiance could never be silenced. Survivors' testimonies became the camp's only surviving monument. Alexander Pichesky, remembered simply as Sasha by those who followed him, embodied Sobibor's spirit of resistance. After escaping, he joined Soviet partisans and survived the war, later giving testimony about the uprising. His accounts described not only the planning and execution of the revolt, but the moral weight carried by all who fought. He spoke of courage, but also of loss, remembering those who had fallen in the minefields and under the hail of bullets. His testimony became a cornerstone for understanding Sobibor, providing details that no outside observer could ever have reconstructed. Yet his post-war life was not one of ease in the Soviet Union. His Jewish identity and the suspicion of former POWs made his legacy complicated. Still, his words endured, preserved in interviews, memoirs, and court records. For survivors and historians alike, Pichesky's voice was a guiding light through the shadows of Sobibor. He transformed memory into history. Another voice of immense importance was that of Thomas Toivy Blatt, a Polish Jew who survived Sobibor as a teenager. After escaping during the uprising, he lived in hiding until liberation, later emigrating to the United States. For decades he dedicated his life to preserving the memory of Sobibor, interviewing fellow survivors and publishing works that remain foundational. His memoirs, such as From the Ashes of Sobibor, gave a deeply personal account of daily life in the camp and the revolt's harrowing escape. Blatt's words were not only historical testimony, but acts of moral remembrance, ensuring that the victim's humanity was never lost in statistics. He carried with him the scars of youth stolen by genocide, but also the strength of one who chose to bear witness. In classrooms, courtrooms, and conferences, Blatt spoke tirelessly about Sobibor. His work bridged the gap between history and memory, between the living and the dead. Through his voice, Sobibor found permanence in the world's conscience. Survivors like Esther Rayeb also ensured that Sobibor's story reached far beyond the soil of Poland. Rayeb, one of the few women to escape the camp, recounted the terror of daily life and the courage of resistance. Her testimony highlighted not only the brutality of guards, but also the resilience of women who endured humiliation and still fought for dignity. Through her, the perspective of women at Sobibor became visible, countering the tendency of early histories to focus only on male leadership. She described the fear, the whispered solidarity, and the extraordinary courage required to take part in a revolt with death surrounding every step. Her words offered both detail and depth, reminding the world that Sobibor's tragedy and defiance were shared by men, women, and children alike. Rayeb's voice, preserved in interviews and documentaries, gave Sobibor's memory an intimate human face. Her survival was both testimony and triumph. Through her, the untold stories of countless women emerged from silence. The survivors' voices gained renewed importance during war crimes trials, where their testimonies served as evidence against perpetrators. In courtrooms across Europe, they faced former guards and officers, recounting horrors in vivid detail. Their words often pierced the walls of denial, dismantling lies with lived experience. These testimonies gave juries and judges a glimpse into a place otherwise lost to history, where documents had been destroyed and structures erased. Without survivors, Sobibor might have remained a forgotten corner of Operation Reinhard. Instead, their presence turned trials into arenas of remembrance. Each survivor became both a witness and a representative of those who could no longer speak. Their voices were weapons of truth in a world still struggling to comprehend the scale of Nazi crimes. Through testimony, Sobibor became undeniable. The camp's silence was broken not by ruins, but by words. In the decades that followed, survivors fought against fading memory as the world moved on from war. They gave interviews, wrote memoirs, and participated in films and documentaries, ensuring Sobibor's story remained alive. Some spoke to students, planting seeds of remembrance in future generations. Others worked with historians, piecing together maps and details of the camp long after the Nazis had tried to erase it. Each voice carried fragments of truth, which together formed a mosaic of memory. They spoke not only of gas chambers and fences, but of friendships, small acts of kindness, and moments of humanity amid horror. These details gave Sobibor's story life, making it more than numbers and statistics. Their commitment turned memory into education, shaping Holocaust studies as a field. The survivors became teachers of history and morality alike. Their voices defied both time and forgetting. The memoirs and testimonies of Sobibor's survivors also played a crucial role in exposing the broader framework of Operation Reinhard. Through their recollections, historians pieced together the system that linked Belzec, Treblinka, and Sobibor into a machine of annihilation. Survivors described the transport systems, the deception of fake railway stations, and the routines of extermination. These details revealed the efficiency and bureaucracy that had defined Operation Reinhard, filling in gaps left by destroyed Nazi records. The survivors became not only witnesses of their own suffering, but chroniclers of a genocide. Their testimonies ensured that the truth of Reinhard's machinery could not be erased alongside its camps. Without them, the world might never have known the scale of the operation's cruelty. Their voices connected Sobibor to the larger Holocaust narrative. In doing so, they ensured that Operation Reinhard's crimes were exposed in full. Sobibor survivors carried their memories as both burden and mission, turning trauma into testimony for the sake of history. Their voices ensured that the camp the Nazis tried to erase lived on in global memory. Through Piechesky's leadership, Blatt's writing, Rave's testimony, and countless others, the truth of Sobibor was preserved for generations. Their words continue to echo in museums, memorials, and classrooms, shaping the way humanity understands genocide. The role of testimony was not merely historical, it was moral, a call to resist hatred and silence. The survivors, though few, spoke for hundreds of thousands who perished without graves or names. Their defiance did not end in 1943. It continued in every word they shared. Sobibor was destroyed, but its memory was indestructible. The voices of its survivors ensured that history could not be plowed under. Their testimony became Sobibor's most enduring monument. Long after the Nazis plowed over Sobibor's grounds and planted crops to conceal their crimes, the soil itself refused to keep silent. In the post-war years, survivors, historians, and archaeologists returned to the site, determined to uncover what had been hidden. Excavations began tentatively in the 1960s, but it was not until later decades that systematic digs revealed the true scale of the camp. Beneath fields of rye and lupins lay remnants of gas chambers, foundations of barracks and personal items of victims, buttons, jewelry, children's shoes. Each discovery gave voice to the hundreds of thousands silenced there. The excavations confirmed survivor testimonies, proving that Sobibor had not been erased, only concealed. Memorials were erected, beginning with modest plaques, and eventually expanding into museums and monuments. Today, visitors walk among pathways marked by stones and reconstructed outlines of buildings, tracing the geography of genocide. Sobibor, once meant to disappear, has been restored in memory through the persistence of truth. The earth itself bears witness where silence once reigned. The archaeological digs at Sobibor revealed not only structures but humanity itself. In 2014, researchers uncovered remnants of the gas chambers buried beneath layers of earth that had been ploughed and replanted by the Nazis. These foundations told a silent yet powerful story of systematic murder, their layout matching survivor descriptions with chilling precision. The discoveries included thousands of personal artifacts, coins, keys, hairpins, fragments of Torah scrolls. Each item represented a life interrupted, a family destroyed, a story never completed. These artifacts now stand in museums as fragile bridges between the present and the past. Visitors are confronted not only with statistics, but with the intimacy of human loss. Archaeology transformed Sobibor from an abstract place of numbers into a tangible reminder of individuality. The camp's excavation redefined Holocaust remembrance, grounding memory in material reality. Sobibor's soil, once weaponized for concealment, became a reservoir of testimony. In the ruins, silence was finally broken. Sobibor's memory also lives on in literature, memoirs, and films that have carried its story to global audiences. Works like Escape from Sobibor, both the book and the 1987 film adaptation, dramatized the revolt and brought survivor voices into popular consciousness. These accounts, based on testimony from men like Thomas Blatt and Yehuda Lerner, captured not only the horror of the camp, but the extraordinary defiance of its prisoners. Documentaries and historical studies expanded this picture, weaving together survivor interviews, archival evidence, and modern research. Through these cultural works, Sobibor became more than a footnote in Operation Reinhard. It became a symbol of resistance within annihilation. Schools taught its story, museums curated its memory, and writers revisited its tragedy with each new generation. The camp that the Nazis sought to erase found permanence in art and scholarship. Every retelling became an act of remembrance. Sobibor's revolt, preserved in books and film, gave the camp its place in collective memory. Holocaust education has made Sobibor central to understanding not only genocide but human resilience. Teachers use survivor testimonies to show that even in places built solely for extermination, resistance was possible. The revolt demonstrates that defiance did not end at the camp gates, but lived in every plan, every whisper, every strike of an axe on October 14th, 1943. Museums and educational programs emphasize the uniqueness of Sobibor's story, a camp designed for secrecy, destroyed by its own prisoners' rebellion. For students, it serves as a lesson in both despair and courage, a confrontation with humanity at its worst and best. The camp's history is taught alongside Auschwitz and Treblinka, ensuring its voice is not lost amid larger narratives. Survivors who dedicated their lives to education, like Blatt and Rab, became central figures in this mission. Through them, Sobibor entered classrooms far beyond Poland. Holocaust education turned Sobibor into a permanent warning. It teaches that memory itself is a form of resistance. The memorial sites at Sobibor today stand as solemn landscapes of remembrance, blending history with silence. Visitors walk along paths where barbed wire once stood, pausing at markers that outline the gas chambers and barracks. A mound of ashes, gathered from the soil itself, stands as a collective grave for the hundreds of thousands murdered there. The monument is stark, devoid of ornament, allowing silence to speak louder than words. Annual commemorations bring together survivors' families, dignitaries, and students, who light candles and lay flowers. Each ceremony renews the vow that Sobibor's victims will never be forgotten. The site once ploughed to erase memory now compels remembrance. Its quiet fields are not empty. They are heavy with history. The memorial reminds all who come that silence can hide crimes, but remembrance redeems humanity. Sobibor, once concealed, is now a place of truth. Its stones speak where the SS sought silence. Sobibor's legacy also lies in the ongoing struggle against denial and distortion. Holocaust denialists once pointed to the absence of physical remains as proof of fabrication, ignoring survivor testimony. Excavations and survivor voices dismantled these lies, grounding memory in evidence. Each unearthed artifact, each verified testimony, became a counterweight to falsehood. Sobibor's story is therefore not only about remembrance, but about vigilance against forgetting and distortion. In this way, it has become a central part of debates about history, truth, and responsibility. The camp's legacy challenges humanity to protect memory from manipulation. Survivors who dedicated their lives to telling Sobibor's story did so not only for the past, but for the future. Memory was their weapon against erasure, their answer to the Nazis' attempt to bury truth. Sobibor's resilience lies not only in revolt but in remembrance. Its history teaches that denial is the final battle of genocide. Memory must always prevail. The meaning of Sobibor extends beyond its fences, touching on universal questions of resilience and remembrance. It forces us to confront the capacity for cruelty when hatred is left unchecked, but also the power of courage in the darkest of places. The revolt illustrates that even in death camps, humanity was not extinguished, but transformed into resistance. For descendants of survivors, Sobibor is both a wound and a source of pride, proof that their ancestors fought back. For the world, it is a warning, etched in soil and memory, of what happens when prejudice and indifference are allowed to fester. Museums and memorials carry this lesson across borders, reminding future generations that genocide begins with silence and complicity. Sobibor is not only a site of tragedy, but a mirror held up to humanity. In its reflection we see both our potential for cruelty and our capacity for defiance. It is both a scar and a beacon. Memory turns loss into lesson. Sobibor's legacy today is one of tragedy, defiance, and remembrance woven together. Archaeological discoveries, survivor testimonies, films, and education ensure that its story endures where the Nazis once sought silence. The camp's revolt remains a singular chapter in Holocaust history, a testament to resistance amid certain death. Its memory challenges us to recognize both the fragility and resilience of human dignity. Sobibor teaches that remembrance is not passive. It is an act of defiance against erasure, hatred, and denial. Visitors who stand on its quiet grounds are confronted with both the weight of loss and the triumph of survival. The camp is gone, but its meaning has grown larger than its fences ever were. Sobibor lives in classrooms, museums, memorials, and the hearts of those who carry its story. It is a legacy that demands vigilance, compassion, and courage. Through remembrance, Sobibor continues to speak. Its silence has become humanity's voice.